The Texas hill country stretched green and wild that spring, rolling out in waves of limestone ridge and post oak, cut through with ravines that filled and emptied with the season's mood. Blackthorn Ridge Ranch sat in the middle of it all. Not the biggest spread, not the richest, but solid, honest. The kind of place a man could build a life if he kept his head down and his fences tight. Rhett Mercer didn't always keep his head down. He'd spent the last 3 days riding the northern boundary, checking fence lines after the late March storms had torn through. The work was simple, repetitive, the kind that let a man's mind wander while his hands stayed busy. He'd repaired 12 posts, replaced a section of wire that had rusted through, and found evidence of at least one mountain lion working the brush along the creek. Normal problems, fixable problems. He rode Ash, a tall bay gelding with a white blaze and a temperament that matched Rhett's own, patient until pushed, then immovable. The horse picked his way down the familiar trail toward home, ears forward, sensing what Rhett already felt. They were close. Another mile, maybe less. The sun hung low, painting everything gold and orange. Good light, the kind that made a man grateful for what he had. Rhett wore his work clothes. Denim pants gone soft with age, a shirt that had seen better days, boots that fit his feet like a second skin. His hat brim was pulled low against the slanting light. On his hip, he carried a single Colt revolver, the .45 he kept for trail work. Practical. Enough gun for snakes or varmints. Not so much weight that it got in the way of real work. His other revolvers, the matched pair he'd carried during rougher years, those stayed home now, hung on pegs in the bedroom. He hadn't touched them in months, didn't need to. That part of his life was supposed to be finished. The trail opened up as he crested the last rise, and Blackthorn Ridge spread out below him. The main house sat square and solid, built from limestone blocks Rhett had quarried himself. The barn stood 50 yards off, weathered wood silvered by sun and wind. Corrals. A small bunkhouse they barely used anymore. The windmill creaking in the breeze, pumping water up from the good well they'd dug 2 years back. Home. Except something was wrong. 4 horses stood tied at the hitching rail outside the house. Not ranch horses. These were bigger, better fed, carrying expensive saddles with silver trim that caught the dying light. The kind of horses men rode when they wanted to be noticed. Rhett's hand dropped to his revolver without thought, fingers curling around the grip. Ash felt the change in his rider and stopped moving, standing still as carved stone. No smoke from the chimney. That was the first thing. Evelyn always had a fire going this time of day, getting supper started. The windows were dark. No movement visible from this distance, but the front door stood half open. Rhett's jaw tightened. He counted the horses again. 4. Which meant at least 4 men, probably armed, currently inside his house, or near enough to it that their mounts could wait comfortable and calm. This wasn't neighbors stopping by. Neighbors didn't travel in groups of 4, and they sure as hell didn't let themselves in without invitation. He studied the scene, forcing himself to think instead of react. The horses weren't spooked, which meant no violence yet. Animals sensed that kind of tension. The barn doors were closed, everything else looked normal, just those 4 horses and that open door. And somewhere inside or near that house was Evelyn. Rhett touched his heels to Ash's sides, and the gelding started forward, moving at a steady walk down the slope. Not running, not charging, not yet. Rhett kept his hand on his gun and his eyes moving, scanning the windows, the corners of the buildings, anywhere a man might position himself. The yard opened up as he came off the trail. 50 yards out now. 40. Still no movement. Then he saw her. Evelyn stood in the doorway, backlit by the interior darkness. She wasn't moving. Her posture was straight, shoulders back, and even from this distance, Rhett could read the tension in the way she held herself. She wore her everyday dress, dark blue calico, her hair pulled back simple and practical. No apron, which meant she'd been interrupted before she started cooking. She wasn't alone in the doorway. A man stood just behind her, close enough that Rhett could see his outline, but not his face. Big man, broad shoulders, one hand resting on Evelyn's shoulder in a way that made Rhett's vision narrow to a single point of focus. 30 yards. Another man stepped out from the corner of the house, rifle held casual across his chest. He'd been waiting there, positioned to cover the approach. Smart, professional, This wasn't some drifter looking to steal chickens. That's close enough, friend, the man's voice carried across the yard, flat and businesslike. Let's keep this civil. Rhett didn't stop Ash. 25 yards now. I said that's close enough. The rifle came up, not quite aimed, but ready. You're making me nervous. Rhett pulled Ash to a halt. 20 yards from his own front door, stopped on his own land by men who had no right to be there. The gelding shifted beneath him, picking up the tension rolling off his rider in waves. Evelyn. Rhett's voice came out steady, though his pulse hammered in his ears. You all right? She didn't answer immediately. The man behind her, the one with his hand on her shoulder, leaned forward slightly, saying something too quiet for Rhett to hear. I'm fine, Evelyn's voice carried clear and strong. No shake in it, no fear. But Rhett knew her, knew every tone and inflection, and he heard the carefully controlled anger beneath the words. These gentlemen were just explaining their business. That's so. Rhett's gaze shifted to the man with the rifle. Seems like strange business, letting yourself into a man's home while he's away. The man shrugged. We knocked. Door was unlocked. We were invited to wait inside, out of the sun. A lie, and they both knew it. But the man said it easy, like truth and lies were just tools to be used as needed. 2 more men emerged from the house, flanking Evelyn and the big man. 4 total, just like the horses promised. All of them armed, all of them wearing similar clothes. Range gear, but too clean, too new. These weren't working cowboys. They were hired muscle, dressed up to look respectable. The big man, clearly the leader, finally stepped forward enough that Rhett could see his face. Square jaw, dark beard trimmed close, eyes that assessed everything with cold calculation. He removed his hand from Evelyn's shoulder with deliberate slowness, like he was doing Rhett a favor. Mr. Mercer, I presume. The man's voice was smooth, educated. My name is Frank Dalton. I represent the business interests of Mr. Silas Crow. The name hit Rhett like a fist. Everyone in this part of Texas knew Silas Crow. The cattle baron had been buying up ranches for the past 5 years, building an empire that stretched from the hill country down to the coastal plains. Crow didn't just own land, he owned politicians, lawmen, whole towns. Men who crossed him tended to lose their property, their livelihood, sometimes their lives. And now Crow had sent his men to Blackthorn Ridge. I know who Crow is. Rhett kept his voice level. What I don't know is what gives you the right to walk into my house and put your hands on my wife. Dalton smiled, a thin expression that never reached his eyes. Mrs. Mercer has been most hospitable. We were simply having a conversation about your property. Conversation's over. Rhett shifted slightly in the saddle, adjusting his weight. His hand stayed near his gun. Time for you gentlemen to ride out. See, that's the thing, Mr. Mercer. Dalton's tone remained pleasant, conversational. We're not finished with our business yet. Mr. Crow sent us to deliver a message, and I intend to deliver it properly. Then deliver it and go. Dalton glanced at the other 3 men, some unspoken signal passing between them. The one with the rifle stayed positioned at the corner. The other 2 spread out slightly, creating angles. Professional positioning. These men knew what they were doing. Mr. Crow is prepared to make you a very generous offer for Blackthorn Ridge, Dalton said. More than generous, actually. Triple what you paid for the land, plus relocation expenses and a bonus for your trouble. All you have to do is sign the papers and walk away clean. Rhett had heard stories about Crow's offers. They always sounded good on the surface, until you looked closer and realized you were signing away not just land but water rights, mineral rights, everything. And the men who refused those offers tended to find their cattle poisoned, their wells fouled, their buildings burning in the night. Not interested, Rhett said. Dalton's smile widened. I don't think you understand the situation, Mr. Mercer. This isn't a negotiation. This is a courtesy. Mr. Crow wants this land, and he's going to get it. The only question is whether you walk away with money in your pocket or whether we have to do this the hard way. There's no we doing anything, Rhett said quietly. There's you, standing on my property without permission, threatening me and my wife. That's called trespassing. Some places, it's called a lot worse. One of the men near Dalton laughed, a short bark of amusement. Big talk for a man outnumbered 4-1. Rhett's eyes never left Dalton. 4-2. My wife's got a Winchester aimed at your spine from the kitchen window. It was a bluff. Evelyn was still standing in the doorway, and Rhett had no idea if she'd managed to get to a rifle. But Dalton's eyes flickered, just for a second, the first crack in his composed exterior. Evelyn's voice came from the doorway, steady as a rock. He's not lying. I'd prefer not to shoot anyone today, but I will if I have to. Another bluff, Rhett thought, but her tone carried absolute conviction. The men shifted uneasily, no longer quite so confident in their numbers. Dalton's jaw tightened. This is foolish, Mercer. You're making an enemy you can't afford. I didn't make anything, Rhett said. You rode onto my land. You put your hands on my wife. You threatened my home. Far as I'm concerned, we're already enemies. Question is what you're going to do about it. The silence stretched out, tension thick enough to choke on. Rhett could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, and this would turn into bloodshed. His palm was slick on the revolver grip, but he kept his breathing steady, his expression calm. It was Dalton who blinked first. Boys, he said quietly, mount up. We're leaving. The man with the rifle didn't move. Boss said, I know what the boss said. Dalton's voice turned sharp. And I'm telling you, we're done here, for now. The emphasis on those last two words carried its own threat. This wasn't over. This was just a tactical retreat, a temporary withdrawal before the real pressure started. The four men moved toward their horses with reluctant steps, clearly unhappy about backing down. Dalton paused at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at Evelyn. Ma'am, you seem like a reasonable woman. Maybe you can talk some sense into your husband. Mr. Crow always gets what he wants, always. The men who understand that early save themselves a lot of grief. Evelyn's voice could have cut glass. My husband's sense is just fine, Mr. Dalton. Yours, I'm less sure about. You're still on our property. Dalton's expression hardened, but he tipped his hat in mock courtesy and turned to his horse. The four men mounted up, taking their time about it, making sure Rhett understood they were leaving by choice, not because they were forced to. Rhett sat Ash perfectly still, watching them go. His hand never left his gun until they'd ridden out through the gate and disappeared over the rise, heading south toward Crow's main holdings. Only then did he dismount, legs stiff from 3 days in the saddle and the tension of the last few minutes. Ash blew out a long breath, shaking his mane. Evelyn came down the porch steps, moving fast now that the immediate threat was gone. She'd been holding herself rigid, and Rhett could see the tremor in her hands as the adrenaline started to fade. You all right? He reached for her, and she came into his arms hard, pressing her face against his chest. I'm fine. Her voice was muffled against his shirt. I'm fine. They didn't hurt me. They were polite, actually, right up until the threat started. Rhett held her tight, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his ribs. How long were they here? About an hour before you showed up. They came to the door, said they had business with you. I told them you were out checking fences and they should come back tomorrow. That's when Dalton said they'd wait inside and the others just pushed past me. Polite about it, but they made it clear I didn't have a choice. Anger flared hot in Rhett's chest. Did they touch you? Besides Dalton's hand on your shoulder? No, they searched the house, though. Looking for something, I think, though they pretended they were just admiring the place. They went through the bedroom, the office, even the cellar. Dalton asked a lot of questions about the wells, about water rights, about where the property lines run. That confirmed what Rhett had suspected. This wasn't just about the land itself, it was about the water beneath it. In Texas, water rights could be worth more than the surface acreage, especially in dry country where a good well meant the difference between prosperity and dust. Blackthorn Ridge sat on top of one of the best aquifers in the region. Rhett had known that, when he bought the place, had paid extra for it. If Crow was building an empire, he'd need water to sustain it, and he'd already bought or driven off most of the other ranchers with good wells, which made Blackthorn Ridge the last piece Crow needed. There was no rifle in the kitchen, was there? Rhett said quietly. Evelyn pulled back enough to look up at him, and despite everything, there was a ghost of a smile on her lips. No, but they didn't know that. Christ, Evelyn, if they'd called your bluff. They didn't. Her voice was firm. And your timing was perfect. Another 10 minutes, and I might have actually had to shoot someone, rifle or no rifle. Rhett studied her face, seeing the steel beneath the fear. This was the woman who'd crossed half of Texas in a wagon when she was barely 20, who'd helped him build this ranch from nothing, who could birth a calf, mend a fence, and keep books that would make a banker weep with envy. She wasn't fragile. She'd never been fragile. But she also shouldn't have to face down armed men alone in her own home. "This is Silas Crow we're talking about," Rhett said. "He's not going to take no for an answer. Dalton was just the opening move. Next time it'll be worse." "I know." Evelyn's jaw set in that stubborn line he knew so well. "So what do we do?" Rhett looked toward the house, then back the way Dalton and his men had ridden. The smart play would be to pack up, take Crow's money, or whatever fraction of it they could actually get in writing, and start over somewhere else. That's what most men would do when faced with an enemy who had unlimited resources and no scruples about using them. But Rhett Mercer wasn't most men, and he'd learned a long time ago that running from a fight just meant dying tired. "We fight," he said simply. Evelyn nodded like she'd expected nothing else. "How?" That was the question, wasn't it? 4 hired guns had just walked through his house and made themselves comfortable, and that was just the scouting party. Crow could send 40 men if he wanted, could lay siege to the ranch, could burn them out or starve them out, or simply wait until Rhett made a mistake. Unless Rhett didn't wait for Crow to make the next move. "Help me with Ash," he said, taking the gelding's reins. "Then I need to show you something." They walked to the barn together, Evelyn staying close to his side. The familiar smell of hay and horse and old wood wrapped around them as they stepped inside. Rhett unsaddled Ash, rubbing the gelding down while his mind raced through possibilities and discarded most of them. Direct confrontation was suicide. Legal channels would take months, maybe years, and Crow owned half the judges in this part of Texas anyway. Asking for help from neighbors would just put more people in danger, and most of them were already intimidated by Crow's reputation, which left one option. The kind of option Rhett had sworn off years ago when he'd hung up his matched revolvers and decided to be a rancher instead of what he'd been before. "Evelyn," he said quietly, finishing with Ash and turning to face her. "I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we really fight Crow, it's not going to be clean, it's not going to be legal, and there's a good chance we both end up dead or on the run." She met his eyes without flinching. "I already know that. Tell me what you're planning." Rhett took a breath. "Crow expects us to sit here and defend what's ours. Build up our fences. Maybe hire some guns of our own. Wait for him to come at us with overwhelming force. That's what every other rancher has done. And they all lost because Crow can outspend them, outlast them, outman them." "So we don't defend," Evelyn said slowly. "We attack." "We attack," Rhett confirmed. "We go straight to Crow Station, right into his stronghold, and we make him understand that taking our land will cost him more than it's worth." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, thinking it through. "That's insane." "Probably. We don't know how many men he has there. Could be 20, could be 50. Could be. We'd be riding into enemy territory with no backup, no support, no way out if things go wrong." "Yes." She smiled then, a real smile this time, sharp and fierce. "When do we leave?" Rhett felt something loosen in his chest, the last doubt falling away. This was why he'd married her. Not because she was safe or soft or willing to stand behind him, but because, when it mattered, she stood beside him and refused to blink. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Early. But first I need to get something." He led her out of the barn and back to the house. The place felt violated now, tainted by Dalton's presence and the knowledge that strangers had walked through their private spaces. They'd fix that later. Clean it. Make it theirs again. In the bedroom, Rhett went to the corner where his old gun belt hung on wooden pegs he'd driven into the wall himself. The leather was oiled and maintained despite years of disuse, the twin holsters waiting empty. The matched Colt sat in a drawer nearby, wrapped in soft cloth. Rhett unwrapped them slowly, feeling the familiar weight settle into his palms. 45 caliber, 6 shots each, custom grips worn smooth by years of practice. These weren't tools for punching cows or shooting varmints. These were weapons built for one purpose: killing men who needed killing. He'd been good with them once. Better than good. The kind of good that made men step aside when he walked into a room, that ended disputes before they could turn into gunfights. He'd left that life behind when he met Evelyn. Had sworn he'd never pick up these guns again, except in the most desperate circumstances. Apparently, desperate circumstances had found him anyway. "I haven't worn these in 3 years," Rhett said quietly, buckling the gun belt around his waist. The weight felt foreign and familiar all at once. like putting on an old coat that didn't quite fit anymore but still remembered the shape of your shoulders. Evelyn watched him load the revolvers, checking each cylinder with practiced efficiency. Will you remember how? Some things you don't forget. He slid the Colts into their holsters, feeling them settle into place. Doesn't mean I'm happy about it. I know. She touched his arm gently. But if we're doing this, I'd rather you be the man who can, not the man who wishes he could. They spent the rest of the evening preparing. Evelyn dug out her own rifle, a Winchester 73 she'd inherited from her father, well-maintained and deadly accurate in her hands. She'd grown up hunting deer and turkey in the East Texas pine forest, and she could put a bullet through a silver dollar at 100 yards. Rhett cleaned his guns, oiled the mechanisms, loaded spare ammunition into his belt. They gathered supplies, food that wouldn't spoil, canteens, rope, matches, a basic medical kit in case things went sideways. As the sun set, they sat on the porch together, not talking much, just being present in what might be their last quiet evening at Blackthorn Ridge. The spring air was cool and sweet, carrying the smell of wildflowers and new grass. Somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called its lonesome song. "Tell me about Crow Station," Rhett said finally. "You've been there before." Evelyn nodded. "Twice, back when I was running supplies for the trading post in town. Before we got married. It's big. Main house, bunkhouse, stables, storage buildings, all arranged around a central yard. Crow lives in the main house with his family. The hired men stay in the bunkhouse. He usually keeps 6 to 8 men on the property at any given time, more during roundup or when he's expecting trouble." "How's it defended?" "Not as well as you'd think. Crow's arrogant. He doesn't believe anyone would be stupid enough to attack him on his own ground. There's a fence around the whole compound, but it's decorative, not defensive. The main house has a good line of sight over the yard, but there are blind spots, old storage buildings on the east side that aren't used anymore. I remember thinking they blocked the view from the house pretty badly." Red absorbed this, building a picture in his mind. "What about guards?" "When I was there, I saw men positioned at the main gate, and usually 1 or 2 walking patrol. But that was during the day, in peacetime. Could be different now." "Could be." Rhett stared out at the darkening land. "We'll scout it first, see what we're up against. But Evelyn, when we ride in there, we're committed. No turning back. You sure about this?" She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but absolutely certain. "Dalton put his hand on my shoulder in my own house. He made me feel helpless in the place where I should be safest. I want him to know that was a mistake. I want Crow to know he can't just take whatever he wants. Even if it costs us everything? Even then." She turned to look at him, her eyes catching the last light. "This is our home, Rhett. Our land. We built it together. If we let Crow take it without a fight, what does that make us?" Rhett had no answer for that, because she was right. Some things were worth fighting for, even against impossible odds, especially against impossible odds. They went to bed early but didn't sleep much. Rhett lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the guns on the bedside table. Beside him, Evelyn's breathing never quite settled into the deep rhythm of sleep. Just before dawn, she spoke into the darkness. "What if we lose?" "Then we lose together," Rhett said, "and at least we'll know we didn't go quiet." "That's not much comfort. It's all I've got." She rolled toward him, and in the pre-dawn gray, he could just make out her face. "Promise me something." "Anything. Whatever happens tomorrow, whether we win or lose or something in between, promise me we stick together. No heroic sacrifices. No, you run while I hold them off bullshit. We walk out of this together or not at all." Rhett pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I promise." They rose with the sun, moving through the morning routine with quiet efficiency. Coffee. Cold biscuits left from yesterday. Checking weapons, saddling horses, making sure everything they might need was secured and ready. Rhett wore his twin Colts openly now, the gun belt settled comfortable on his hips despite the years. Evelyn had her Winchester in a saddle scabbard, easily accessible. They looked like what they were, 2 people riding toward violence with their eyes wide open. As they mounted up, Rhett took one last look at Blackthorn Ridge. The house stood solid in the morning light, built to last generations. The windmill turned in the breeze, pumping water that Silas Crow wanted for himself. The land rolled away in every direction, green and alive and worth dying for. "Ready?" Evelyn asked. Rhett settled his hat and gathered his reins. No, but let's go anyway. They rode south, toward Crow Station, and whatever waited for them there. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of day that made you glad to be alive and on horseback in Texas. Birds sang in the brush, rabbits scattered at their approach. The world continued on, indifferent to human struggles and small acts of defiance. It took 3 hours to reach the border of Crow's property. The difference was visible immediately. Better fences, cleared land, cattle bearing the Crow brand grazing in fat contentment. This was what empire looked like, organized, prosperous, overwhelming in its scope. They kept to the ridges, staying out of sight, working their way closer to the main compound. Evelyn guided them along routes she remembered from her supply runs, avoiding the main roads where they'd be spotted. Finally, just before noon, they crested a rise and saw Crow Station spread out below them. Evelyn hadn't exaggerated. The place was more like a small fortress than a ranch, with buildings arranged in a defensive square around a central courtyard. The main house dominated the north side, 2 stories of whitewashed stone, with a wide porch and windows that commanded a view of the entire compound. Rhett counted 6 men visible in the yard, moving about their business. Probably more inside the buildings. The main gate stood open, guarded by a single man lounging against the fence post. See those buildings on the east side? Evelyn pointed. The ones with the sagging roofs? Those are the old storage sheds I mentioned. They're between the main house and the east fence. Good cover, and they block the line of sight from Crow's windows. Rhett studied the layout, his mind automatically calculating angles and distances. If you could get to those buildings without being seen, you'd have a shot at the whole yard. I could make that shot, Evelyn said quietly. He looked at her. This is the part where I'm supposed to tell you to stay back, keep safe, let me handle it. And this is the part where I remind you that I'm a better shot than you are, and we promise to do this together. She wasn't wrong on either count. Rhett had always been competent with a rifle, but Evelyn was exceptional, and they'd need every advantage they could get. All right, he said. Here's what we do. They spent the next hour finalizing the plan, watching the compound, timing the patrol patterns of the guards. It was risky, maybe suicidal, but it had one thing going for it. Nobody would expect it. Silas Crow had built his empire on the assumption that fear and money could solve any problem. He'd never faced people who refused to be bought and were too angry to be scared. That was about to change. As the sun climbed toward its peak, Rhett and Evelyn separated. She worked her way east, using the broken terrain to stay hidden, heading for those old storage buildings that would give her a commanding view of the yard. Rhett rode straight down the main approach, sitting tall in the saddle, his hands visible and empty. Not sneaking, not hiding, riding in like he owned the place, like he had every right to be there. The guard at the gate straightened up as Rhett approached, hand moving to his gun. Hold it right there, friend. State your business. Rhett reined in Ash 20 feet from the gate. Name's Rhett Mercer. I'm here to see Silas Crow. Tell him it's about Blackthorn Ridge. The guard's eyes widened slightly. Clearly he'd heard about yesterday's confrontation. Mr. Crow ain't taking visitors without an appointment. He'll take this one. Rhett's voice was calm, almost friendly. Unless he wants his business discussed out here in the yard where everyone can hear. The guard hesitated, clearly uncertain. This wasn't in the script. People didn't just ride up to Crow Station and demand an audience. Wait here, the guard finally said, turning to call toward the main house. Someone get Mr. Dalton. We got a situation. Rhett waited, counting seconds, giving Evelyn time to get into position. He could feel sweat trickling down his back despite the cool air, feel his heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him that this was a terrible idea, that he should turn Ash around and ride like hell. But that wasn't an option anymore. Maybe it never had been. Frank Dalton emerged from the main house, moving fast across the yard. His face registered genuine surprise when he saw Rhett sitting calmly on his horse outside the gate. Mr. Mercer. Dalton's hand rested on his gun. This is unexpected. Life's full of surprises, Rhett said. I'm here to see your boss. We need to have a conversation about yesterday's misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding, Dalton said coldly. You were given an offer. You refused it. That's pretty clear. Maybe I want to reconsider. Rhett kept his voice level, reasonable. Or maybe I just want to hear Crow's offer from the man himself, not his errand boy. Dalton's jaw tightened, anger flashing in his eyes. You've got balls, Mercer. I'll give you that. Riding in here alone, making demands. Either you're brave or you're stupid. Could be both. Rhett shifted slightly in the saddle. Are you going to get your boss, or do I have to shout for him? For a long moment, Dalton just stared at him, clearly trying to figure out the angle. Why would Mercer ride straight into enemy territory unless he was ready to surrender? What was he playing at? Finally, Dalton jerked his head toward the house. Dismount and hand over your weapons. Then we'll see if Mr. Crow's interested in talking. I'll keep my weapons, thanks, and I'll stay mounted until I see Crow. That's not how this works. Rhett smiled, cold and sharp. Then I guess Crow doesn't hear what I have to say. Your call, Dalton. The standoff stretched out, tension ratcheting up with every passing second. Rhett could see other men gathering in the yard now, drawn by the confrontation. 6, 7, 8, more than Evelyn had estimated. This was going to get messy. Dalton finally turned and strode back toward the main house, disappearing inside. Rhett used the time to scan the compound, looking for Evelyn's position. There, movement in the window of the old storage building. Just a flicker, but enough to tell him she was in place. The front door of the main house opened, and Silas Crow himself stepped out onto the porch. Rhett had never seen the man in person before, but there was no mistaking him. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing expensive clothes that somehow didn't look out of place on a working ranch. Silver hair, sharp eyes, the bearing of a man who'd built an empire through will and ruthlessness. Crow walked to the edge of the porch, hands clasped behind his back, studying Rhett with open curiosity. Mr. Mercer, Crow's voice was deep, cultured, almost friendly. This is quite the surprise. Frank tells me you want to negotiate. I want to understand what I'm up against, Rhett said, honestly. Man hears stories about Silas Crow, but stories aren't the same as meeting face to face. Crow smiled, clearly pleased. Well, you're here now. What do you think? Rhett looked around the compound, the buildings, the men, the visible wealth and power. I think you're a man who's used to getting what he wants. An astute observation. I am indeed. And what I want, Mr. Mercer, is your land and water rights. Frank made you a generous offer yesterday. I'm prepared to honor that offer, despite your discourteous response. My wife has different feelings about yesterday's courtesy, Rhett said quietly. Something flickered across Crow's face, not quite guilt, but acknowledgement. I apologize if my men made her uncomfortable. That wasn't my intention. I simply needed to demonstrate the seriousness of my interest. You demonstrated it. Rhett's hand moved closer to his gun, a subtle shift that didn't go unnoticed. Now I'm here to demonstrate mine. Crow's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening me, Mr. Mercer? On my own property, surrounded by my men. I'm making you an offer, Rhett said. Same as you made me. Walk away from Blackthorn Ridge. Stop sending men to my door. Leave my wife and my land alone. Do that, and we've got no quarrel. The men in the yard laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Even Dalton cracked a smile, shaking his head at Rhett's audacity. But Crow didn't laugh. He studied Rhett with renewed interest, like a man who'd just noticed something unexpected. You rode all the way here, Crow said slowly, into my stronghold surrounded by armed men, just to tell me no. That's right. Why? Because you needed to understand something. Rhett's voice was steady, clear, carrying across the yard. You can buy a lot of things, Crow. You can hire guns, you can threaten and intimidate, you can even burn me out if you're willing to pay the price. But you can't make me afraid. And you can't make me run. The silence that followed was absolute. Every man in the yard had gone still, watching this confrontation between a cattle baron and a rancher who should have known better than to challenge him. Crow's expression hardened. You're either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Mercer. I haven't decided which. Here's hoping you don't have to find out. Rhett gathered his reins. That's all I came to say. You know where I stand now. Your move. He started to turn Ash away from the gate, and that's when Dalton's voice cut across the yard. Not so fast, Mercer. You don't just ride in here, insult Mr. Crow, and ride out. Rhett looked back at Dalton, at the men spreading out in the yard, hands moving toward weapons. That's exactly what I'm doing. Unless you want to try stopping me. Dalton's hand dropped to his gun. Maybe I do. And in the window of the old storage building, 300 yards away, Evelyn Mercer settled the Winchester against her shoulder and took aim at the center of Frank Dalton's chest. The afternoon light slanted golden across Crow Station, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. Birds sang in the cottonwoods. A horse stamped and blew somewhere in the stables. And Rhett Mercer sat his horse in front of the gate, watching Silas Crow's face as the cattle baron finally began to understand that he'd miscalculated badly. "There's one more thing you should know," Rhett said quietly. "I didn't come alone." Crow's eyes went cold and calculating, sweeping the compound with the practiced gaze of a man who'd survived more than one ambush. Dalton froze mid-draw, his hand hovering over his pistol, suddenly aware that the dynamics had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. "What exactly does that mean, Mercer?" Crow's voice remained steady, but there was an edge beneath the calm now. "Means you might want to tell your man Dalton to take his hand off that gun," Rhett said. "Real slow and careful-like." One of the hired men near the bunkhouse laughed nervously. "He's bluffing, boss. Ain't nobody else here." Rhett didn't take his eyes off Crow. "You want to test that theory? Because my partner's got a Winchester pointed at your yard right now, and she doesn't miss. Not at this range. Not ever." Crow's jaw tightened, but his expression shifted. Not quite belief, but enough doubt to make him cautious. He'd built his empire by understanding when to press and when to fold, when a risk was calculated and when it was just stupidity wearing confidence like a mask. "Frank," Crow said quietly, "step back." "Boss, he's running a game on us." "I said step back." Crow's voice cut like a blade, and Dalton's hand moved away from his gun, his face flushing with barely controlled anger. The yard had gone silent, every man watching this standoff play out with the kind of attention reserved for moments that could turn deadly in a heartbeat. Rhett could feel sweat running down his spine, could feel ash shifting beneath him, picking up the tension radiating off everyone present. This was the moment. Either Crow would call the bluff, and this would end in gunfire, or he'd recognize that the cost of finding out was higher than his pride could afford. "You've got spine, Mercer. I'll give you that." Crow descended the porch steps slowly, moving into the yard proper. "Coming here, making threats, pretending you've got leverage. But let's be honest about what's happening. You're one man. Maybe you've got someone in the hills with a rifle. Maybe you don't. Either way, you're still surrounded by 8 of my men, on my property, with no way out that doesn't end badly for you." "Maybe so," Rhett said. "But here's what you need to ask yourself. Is Blackthorn Ridge worth finding out? Because if shooting starts, you're going to lose men. Good men, expensive men. And for what? One ranch you could buy somewhere else for half the trouble?" Crow stopped 10 feet from Ash's shoulder, close enough that Rhett could see the calculation happening behind those sharp eyes. "The water rights under your land are worth the trouble. There's no somewhere else with access to that aquifer." At least the man was honest about it. Rhett almost respected that. "So we're at an impasse," Rhett said. "You want what I've got. I'm not selling, and neither of us is stupid enough to start a war we might not finish. War's end, Mr. Mercer, and I've got more resources to sustain one than you do. Resources don't mean much if you're dead." Rhett kept his voice conversational, like they were discussing cattle prices instead of mutual destruction. "That's the problem with building an empire. Gives you a lot to lose." Something flickered across Crow's face, and for just a moment, Rhett saw past the calculated businessman to the man beneath. There was frustration there, maybe even a grudging respect, but also the cold certainty of someone who'd spent years getting exactly what he wanted and didn't know how to stop. "You should leave now," Crow said finally, "while I'm still willing to let you. Wasn't planning to stay for supper." Rhett started to turn Ash away from the gate, moving slow and deliberate. "But Crow, send men to my door again, and next time I won't come here to talk. We clear?" "Crystal." Crow's smile was thin and utterly without warmth, though I'd suggest you think very carefully about what happens next. You've made your point, but points don't stop bullets, and they don't prevent accidents. Ranching's dangerous work. Fires start, wells get poisoned, good people get hurt. The threat was delivered with perfect calm, like a weather report. Rhett's hand twitched toward his gun, but he forced himself to stay still, to not give Crow the excuse he was clearly fishing for. "Same goes for cattle barons," Rhett said. "Dangerous world out there. Never know when someone might decide your empire's gotten too big for everyone's comfort." They stared at each other across the dusty yard. and the air between them felt thick enough to cut. Every man present understood they were witnessing something that would define how the next weeks or months played out, a line being drawn that couldn't be uncrossed. Crow broke eye contact first, turning back toward the main house. "Frank, let him leave. But make sure he understands this is a courtesy, not a concession." Dalton's face was red with suppressed rage, but he stepped aside from the gate. "You heard the boss. Get out of here, Mercer, and pray we don't see you again." Rhett rode through the gate slowly, every instinct screaming at him to put his heels to ash and run. But running would show weakness, and weakness now would invite exactly the kind of follow-up he couldn't afford. So he kept Ash to a walk, sitting tall in the saddle, looking for all the world like a man without a care. Behind him he could hear the murmur of voices, angry and confused. The men hadn't expected their boss to let an intruder just ride out. Neither had Rhett, if he was being honest. But Crow was smart enough to recognize a bad gamble when he saw one, and smart enough to wait for better odds. Which meant those better odds were coming, probably sooner than later. Rhett didn't head straight back the way he'd come. Instead, he circled east, keeping to the low ground, putting distance between himself and Crow Station before cutting back toward the rendezvous point where he'd agreed to meet Evelyn. She was already there when he arrived, standing beside her mare, the Winchester still in her hands. The moment she saw him, the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. "You're alive," she said, and there was relief in her voice that made Rhett's chest tight, more or less. He dismounted, and his legs nearly buckled. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving exhaustion and the shakes in its wake. "You get into position all right? Clean approach. Those old buildings gave perfect cover, just like I remembered." She tilted her head, studying his face. "How bad did it get?" "About as bad as expected. Crow's not backing down, but he's not rushing in blind either. We bought some time, maybe a few days, maybe a week if we're lucky." Evelyn's expression darkened. "Then we use that time. Come on, we need to get home before dark." The ride back to Blackthorn Ridge took longer than the trip out, both of them watching their back trail for signs of pursuit. But the hills stayed empty, the horizon clear. Crow was letting them go, which somehow felt more ominous than if he'd sent riders after them immediately. The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch, painting the limestone walls of the house in shades of orange and deep red. Everything looked exactly as they'd left it that morning, peaceful and undisturbed, like the confrontation at Crow Station had happened in a different world entirely. They tended the horses in silence, the familiar routine of unsaddling and rubbing down and checking hooves providing a kind of meditation. Rhett's hands moved automatically while his mind replayed the afternoon, picking apart every word, every gesture, looking for the mistakes that might cost them later. "You're thinking too hard," Evelyn said, forking hay into the stalls. "Probably." Rhett hung the saddle on its rack, checking the girth for wear. "Just trying to figure out what Crow's next move is." "Does it matter? We can't predict what he'll do, so we prepare for everything." She wasn't wrong. Rhett had learned that lesson the hard way years ago, back when he'd worn these guns for different reasons. You couldn't outthink every threat, couldn't plan for every contingency. Sometimes all you could do was stay ready and trust your instincts when trouble arrived. They walked back to the house together, and Rhett paused on the porch, looking out at the darkening land. This was what they were fighting for, not just acreage and water rights, but the right to stand here at sunset and feel like they belonged, like this place was theirs in a way that went deeper than deeds and contracts. "You regret it?" Evelyn asked quietly. "Going there today?" "No." Rhett surprised himself with how quickly he answered. "No, I don't. Crow needed to see we won't fold. Whether it changes anything," he shrugged. "Guess we'll find out." Inside, the house still felt wrong, tainted by yesterday's invasion. Evelyn must have felt it too, because she immediately started straightening things that didn't need straightening, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, reclaiming the space in the only way available to her. Rhett built a fire, more for the comfort than the warmth, and they ate a cold supper neither of them tasted. The exhaustion was catching up now, bone deep and heavy, but sleep felt impossible with so much nervous energy still crackling under his skin. "Tell me about before," Evelyn said, settling into the chair across from him. "When you wore those guns for a living instead of just defense." Rhett looked down at the matched Colt still strapped to his hips. He hadn't taken them off since that morning, and they'd started to feel natural again in a way that made him uneasy. Not much to tell that you don't already know, he said. I know the outline. You worked security for mining operations, protected payrolls, settled disputes. But I don't know what that was really like, what it did to you. He was quiet for a long moment, organizing thoughts he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. It was different than this. Cleaner, in a way, because everyone involved knew the rules. You hired on to protect something valuable, and other people hired on to take it. When trouble came, it was expected, almost professional. Did you kill people? Yes. No point in lying about it. Not many, but enough. Men who pushed past talking and into shooting, men who thought they were faster or luckier than they actually were. Evelyn absorbed this without flinching. Do you think about them? Sometimes. Mostly, I try not to. Rhett rubbed his face, feeling stubble rough under his palms. That life, it changes you. Makes you hard in places that should stay soft. I saw men who did it too long, who couldn't turn it off even when the job was done. They'd pick fights in saloons, draw on people over card games, kill men over insults that didn't matter. The gun became who they were instead of what they carried. Is that why you stopped? Part of it? Other part was meeting you and realizing I wanted something different, something that didn't involve measuring my worth by how fast I could clear leather. Evelyn leaned forward, firelight catching in her hair. Do you think you can go back to that? If this thing with Crow turns into what we both know it might turn into? That was the question, wasn't it? Rhett looked at his hands, scarred from ranch work, calloused from rope and leather, but still steady. Still capable of the precision that made the difference between killing a man and missing him entirely. I don't know, he admitted. I'm not the same person I was then. Softer, maybe. Or just older and more aware of what it costs. But if it comes down to protecting you, protecting this place... He met her eyes. Yeah, I can do what needs doing. She nodded slowly, and he could see her making the same calculations, the same preparations. They were walking into something that would test every assumption they held about themselves and each other. The fire burned down to coals while they sat in silence, just being present in the moment. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere in the hills, that lonesome sound that defined the Texas night. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Eventually they went to bed, but sleep came in fragments, broken by sounds that might have been threats or might have been nothing. Every creak of the house settling, every distant noise from the barn sent Rhett's hand reaching for the gun on the nightstand. Dawn came cold and gray, cloud cover rolling in from the west. Rhett stood on the porch with coffee steaming in his hands, watching the horizon for riders that didn't come. The waiting was worse than action, worse than facing down Crow in his own yard. At least then he'd known where he stood. We can't just sit here, Evelyn said from the doorway. She'd dressed for work. Practical clothes, her hair pulled back. The Winchester leaned against the doorframe within easy reach, waiting for him to make the next move while we jump at shadows. What do you suggest? We fortify. Make this place hard enough that Crow thinks twice about a direct assault. And we reach out to the neighbors, see who else is tired of being pushed around. Rhett considered that. Most of the nearby ranchers had already sold out or been driven off, but there were still a few holdouts. The Brennan family 5 miles east, old Marcus Webb up in the northern hills, Sarah Chen who'd inherited her father's spread and refused all offers to buy her out. They're scared, Rhett said. Crow's got a reputation. People who cross him tend to lose more than just land. Then maybe it's time someone reminded them that scared people with common cause can still fight back. Evelyn came to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. We can't do this alone, Rhett. We're good, but we're not that good. She was right, of course. Pride said they could handle Crow by themselves, but reality said they needed allies. Even just a few more guns, a few more people willing to stand firm, might be enough to shift the balance. All right, Rhett said. You ride to the Brennans and the Chen place. I'll head up to Webb's and see if the old bastard's still breathing. We meet back here before dark. Evelyn frowned. We should stay together. Normally, yes. But this is about building a network, showing people they're not alone. We can cover more ground separately. He touched her arm. Besides, Crow won't move this fast. He's still calculating, still planning. We've got a small window. She didn't look happy about it, but she nodded. Be careful. Webb's half crazy on a good day. I'll manage. They saddled fresh horses, Evelyn taking her mare, Rhett switching to a roan gelding he called Red. The matched colt stayed on his hips, a visible reminder that he wasn't riding out unarmed or unprepared. Evelyn swung into the saddle with practiced ease, settling her rifle across her lap. For a moment, they just looked at each other, and Rhett was struck by how much could change in just a few days. 3 days ago, they'd been ranchers, nothing more. Now they were something else. Fighters, resistance, the first line against an empire that thought it could swallow everything in its path. "See you at sunset," Evelyn said. "Sunset," Rhett confirmed, and they rode out in different directions, splitting up despite every instinct that said they should stay together. The ride to Marcus Webb's place took Rhett north into broken country, where the limestone pushed up through thin soil and the trees grew stunted and twisted. Webb had settled here 20 years back, before Crow had even arrived in the territory, and he'd held on to his land through drought and depression and every other hardship the frontier could throw at a man. The old rancher's house appeared as Rhett crested a rocky ridge, a low adobe structure built into the hillside, practically invisible unless you knew where to look. Smoke rose from the chimney, and 3 dogs came boiling out to challenge Rhett's approach with barking that echoed off the rocks. "Webb," Rhett called out, staying mounted. "It's Rhett Mercer from Blackthorn Ridge. I'm coming in to talk." The door creaked open and Marcus Webb stepped out, a rifle cradled in his arms. He was somewhere north of 60, lean as jerky, with a face like weathered saddle leather and eyes that missed nothing. "Mercer," Webb spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Hell you want?" "Few minutes of your time. I've got a proposition that might interest you." "Don't do business with people pointing guns at me." Rhett looked down at the matched colts and smiled slightly. "These aren't pointed at you, but if you'd feel better, I can leave them with the horse." Webb studied him for a long moment, then jerked his head toward the house. "Leave him, and tie that animal where my dogs can't bite him." Rhett dismounted, unbuckling the gun belt and hanging it from the saddle horn. It felt strange being unarmed after 2 days of wearing the revolvers constantly, like he'd left part of himself behind. He tied Red to a fence post and walked toward the house, keeping his hands visible. Webb's place was sparse inside. One main room with a sleeping area curtained off, a table that had seen better days, a stove that looked older than Rhett. But it was clean, well-maintained, the home of someone who took pride in what little he had. "Coffee?" Webb asked, not particularly friendly, but not hostile either. "Appreciate it." They sat at the table with tin cups of coffee strong enough to strip paint, and Webb waited with the patience of a man who'd learned not to waste words. "Silas Crow's making moves on Blackthorn Ridge," Rhett said directly. "Sent men to my place, made threats, tried to pressure me into selling." Webb's expression didn't change. And I told him no. Rode to Crow Station yesterday and told him to his face that my land isn't for sale. That got a reaction. Webb's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "You rode into Crow Station? Alone? More or less. Point is, Crow's not backing off. He wants the water rights under my land, and he's going to keep pushing until he gets them, or until someone pushes back hard enough to make it not worth the effort." "So push back." Webb sipped his coffee. "You got guns. You got guts, apparently. What's that got to do with me?" "You're next," Rhett said bluntly. "Or maybe you're not next. Maybe you're third or fifth. But Crow's consolidating this whole region. Everyone who hasn't sold is on his list. Question is whether we face him separately and get picked off one by one, or whether we stand together and make it too expensive for him to keep pushing." Webb was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee like it held answers. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired. "I'm too old for range wars, Mercer. Fought in one back in 71, lost friends, damn near lost my life. I just want to live out my years in peace." "I understand that. But peace isn't an option if Crow decides he wants your land. And he will want it eventually. That's how empires work. They don't stop expanding until something stops them." "Maybe." Webb set down his cup. "Or maybe he'll get what he wants from you and the Chen woman and the Brennans, and he'll leave an old man alone because it's not worth the trouble." "You believe that?" "No." Webb's smile was bitter. "But I'd like to. Lot easier than the alternative." Rhett leaned forward. "I'm not asking you to fight, not directly. Just asking you to be ready. Have your guns loaded, your supplies stocked. And if things go sideways, if Crow sends men your way or tries to burn you out, you shoot first and send word to the rest of us. We look out for each other, share information, Make sure nobody faces this alone. An alliance. A loose one. Just neighbors watching each other's backs. Webb scratched his jaw, thinking it through. Who else you talk to? My wife's visiting the Brennans and Chen today. Figured I'd start with you since you've been here longest, know this territory better than anyone. Flattery won't work on me, boy. Wasn't trying to flatter, just stating facts. Rhett finished his coffee. Look, I know you don't owe me anything. We've been neighbors for 3 years and barely said 2 words to each other. But Crow's going to force a choice whether we like it or not. I'd rather make that choice on my terms than his. Webb stood and walked to the window, looking out at his hard-scrabble land with the kind of expression men get when they're seeing something beyond the physical. Built this place with my own hands. Adobe bricks, timber beams, every damn stone in that fireplace. My wife's buried up on that ridge where the wind blows clean. This is all I got left of her, of the life we made. Then fight for it. I did fight. For 50 years I fought. Against Indians, against weather, against land that didn't want to be tamed. I'm tired, Mercer. Bone tired. And I don't know if I got another fight left in me. Rhett stood, leaving his empty cup on the table. I'm not asking you to decide today. Just think about it. And if you hear anything, riders passing through, men asking questions, anything that seems off, you send word to Blackthorn Ridge. Can you do that much? Webb turned from the window, and for just a moment Rhett saw past the exhaustion to the man he must have been 20 years ago. Tough. Unbreakable. The kind of man who carved a life out of nothing because he was too stubborn to quit. I can do that, Webb said quietly. And Mercer? You watch yourself. Crow's got more resources than all of us combined. Going up against him is like spitting at a thunderstorm. Makes you feel tough, but doesn't change the outcome. Maybe. Or maybe enough people spitting together can redirect the storm. Webb actually smiled at that. You got optimism, I'll give you that. Hope it keeps you warm when winter comes. They shook hands at the door, and Rhett retrieved his gun belt from Red's saddle, buckling it back on with relief. The weight felt right, necessary. He mounted up and turned Red back toward home, leaving Webb standing in his doorway watching him go. The ride back gave Rhett time to think, to process the conversation and what it meant. Webb wasn't ready to commit, but he wasn't refusing either. That was something. Not much, but enough to build on if given time. The question was whether they had that time. The sun was sliding toward the western horizon when Rhett spotted the riders. 3 of them, coming fast from the south, pushing their horses harder than was smart in this terrain. Rhett's hand went to his revolver as he pulled Red to a stop behind a stand of cedar, watching the riders approach. They weren't heading for Webb's place. The angle was wrong. They were cutting straight across country toward Blackthorn Ridge, and they were in a hurry. Crow's men? Possibly. But the way they rode, bunched together, focused forward, not watching their surroundings, that didn't fit with professional hired guns. These were people running toward something, not hunting. Rhett waited until they'd passed, then urged Red forward, angling to intercept their trail. The hoofprints were deep, dirt thrown up by speed. He followed them for half a mile before he recognized where they were heading. The Brennan place. His stomach dropped. Evelyn had ridden to the Brennans this morning. If Crow had moved against them, if he'd somehow known about the alliance building and struck first, Rhett drove his heels into Red's sides and the gelding jumped forward into a gallop. The terrain blurred past, rocks and scrub and empty sky. His mind raced faster than the horse, calculating distances and timing, trying to figure out if he could reach the Brennan ranch before whatever was going to happen actually happened. The Brennan place sat in a shallow valley, protected on 3 sides by hills. Good land, decent water, big enough to support a family, but small enough that one man could work it with help from his sons. Patrick Brennan was a good neighbor, the kind of man who'd lend you tools or help with roundup without expecting anything in return. Rhett saw the smoke before he crested the last ridge. Black smoke, thick and ugly, rising from the valley below. His hands tightened on the reins, and Red fought the bit, sensing his rider's tension. The Brennan ranch was burning. Not the whole thing, the house still stood intact. But the barn was fully engulfed, flames reaching high into the afternoon air, sparks flying up to dance with the smoke. Rhett could hear the screams of animals trapped inside, could see people running with buckets from the well, trying to fight a fire that was already beyond fighting. He rode down the slope fast, heedless of the danger, looking for Evelyn in the chaos. There, near the corral, helping move horses away from the heat. She looked up as he approached, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide with shock and anger. What happened? Rhett dismounted before Red had fully stopped, nearly stumbling in his haste. They came about an hour after I got here, Evelyn said, her voice shaking. 4 men. Told Patrick they were representing Crow, said he had 1 week to accept the offer or face consequences. Patrick told them to get off his land. And they burned the barn? Not directly. They rode off, but one of them must have circled back. By the time we smelled smoke, it was already too far gone. She grabbed his arm. Rhett, there were horses in there. 3 of Patrick's best, trapped because the doors were barred from outside. The implications hit him like a fist. This wasn't just intimidation or property damage. This was deliberate cruelty, calculated to cause maximum pain and fear. Crow was sending a message that couldn't be ignored. Patrick Brennan appeared through the smoke, his face blackened, his hands blistered from trying to break into the burning barn. 2 of his sons flanked him, barely more than boys, looking shell-shocked and useless. "Mercer!" Patrick's voice was hoarse from smoke and shouting. "This you're doing? You stirring up trouble with Crow?" The accusation stung, partly because it wasn't entirely unfair. Rhett had ridden to Crow Station, had drawn a line. Maybe this was the response. Not direct assault on Blackthorn Ridge, but punishment for anyone who might consider joining forces. "I came here looking for allies," Rhett said carefully. "People who might stand together against Crow's expansion. I didn't think he'd move this fast." "Well, he did." Patrick gestured at the burning barn, at the chaos. 3 horses gone. Probably $10,000 worth of equipment and hay, all because you decided to play hero and drag the rest of us into your fight. "This isn't my fight. It's everyone's fight. Crow left me alone until today." Patrick's voice rose, anger overcoming the shock. "I never gave him cause to notice me. I kept my head down, worked my land, minded my business. Then your wife shows up talking about resistance and alliances, and suddenly my barn's burning." Evelyn stepped forward, her own anger rising to match Patrick's. "That barn burned because Crow decided to burn it. Not because we asked you to stand with us. He's coming for you eventually, regardless of what we do or don't do. We're just trying to make sure people are ready when that happens." "Ready?" Patrick laughed, a broken sound. "Look around, Mrs. Mercer. This is what ready looks like. My livelihood destroyed, my animals dead, and me standing here with burned hands and empty pockets. How exactly does your alliance help me now?" The 3 riders Rhett had seen earlier had dismounted and were helping fight the fire, but it was clear the barn was lost. The best anyone could do now was keep the flames from spreading to the other buildings. "I'm sorry," Rhett said, and he meant it. "I'm sorry this happened, and you're right. I didn't think it through. Didn't consider that Crow might strike at the weakest targets first." "Weakest?" Patrick's eyes flashed. "You think I'm weak?" "I think you're exposed. We all are. Separately. That's the whole point of standing together." "Your standing together just cost me 3 horses and my winter feed." Patrick turned away, gesturing to his sons. "Get buckets. Try to save what we can. And Mercer, don't come back here. You and your wife both. I want nothing to do with whatever war you're starting." There was nothing to say to that. Rhett had come looking for allies and had instead created an enemy, or at least driven a potential friend into neutrality born of fear and anger. He and Evelyn remounted and rode away from the Brennan place, leaving the family to salvage what they could from the ruins. The sun was setting now, painting the smoke in shades of red and gold that looked almost beautiful if you could ignore the destruction beneath. They rode in silence for a long time, both processing what had just happened and what it meant. "He's right," Evelyn said finally. "Patrick, this is our fault." "No." Rhett's voice was firm. "This is Crow's fault. He gave the order, or at least approved it. We're just the excuse he used." Does that distinction matter to Patrick, to his boys who watched their horses burn? It should. But Rhett wasn't sure he believed it himself. Intentions didn't feed cattle or rebuild barns. Results mattered. And the result of their alliance building was one family devastated and unwilling to help. "What about the Chen place?" Evelyn asked. "Did you see any signs of trouble there?" "I didn't go there. Went to Webb's instead, and he's—" Rhett searched for the right word. "Cautious. Sympathetic, maybe, but not ready to commit to anything that might provoke Crow. So we're alone." "Looks like it." They rode into Blackthorn Ridge just as full dark settled over the land, the ranch buildings lit by lamplight from inside the house. Everything looked peaceful, untouched, exactly as they'd left it that morning. But Rhett couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just lost ground they couldn't afford to lose. Crow had demonstrated reach, ruthlessness, and perfect timing. He'd turned a potential alliance into a warning for anyone else considering resistance. And worst of all, he had done it without ever directly attacking Rhett or Evelyn themselves. The message was clear. Your neighbors will suffer for your defiance. Every choice you make will cost someone else their livelihood or their life. They tended their horses in silence, the familiar routine providing no comfort tonight. When Rhett hung up the saddle, his hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the accumulated tension of a day that had started with hope and ended with ash. Inside the house, Evelyn built up the fire while Rhett stood at the window, watching the darkness for movement that never came. The matched Colts felt heavy on his hips, useless weight that hadn't prevented anything or protected anyone. "We need a new plan," Evelyn said from across the room. "Yeah." Something that doesn't put other people in the crossfire. "Yeah." She came to stand beside him and they both stared out at the night. "What if we just left?" The words came out soft, almost hesitant. "Took what we could carry and rode out tonight. Started over somewhere Crow's influence doesn't reach." Rhett had been thinking the same thing and hated himself for it. "We could, probably should, be the smart play. But we won't. No." He turned to face her. "Because if we run, Crow wins, and the next person who stands up to him will face the same choice, and they'll remember that we ran. It becomes the pattern, resist and either get destroyed or flee. Eventually, nobody resists at all." "That's very noble." Evelyn's voice held an edge. "But nobility doesn't rebuild the Brennan's barn or bring back their horses." "I know. So what do we do, Rhett? Because right now it feels like every option is terrible, and we're just choosing which terrible option we can live with." He didn't have an answer for her. Every strategic thought he'd ever had seemed inadequate against Crow's combination of resources and ruthlessness. They'd proven they had courage by riding to Crow Station. They'd proven they could think tactically by positioning Evelyn with a rifle while Rhett talked. But none of that changed the fundamental imbalance of power. "We adapt," Rhett said finally. "Crow hit the Brennans because they're vulnerable, and he knew Evelyn had been there. He's trying to isolate us, make sure nobody stands with us. So we don't ask people to stand with us. We handle this ourselves, but we handle it in a way that makes Crow understand the cost of continuing." What does that mean specifically? Rhett thought about the layout of Crow Station, about the empire built on land and water and intimidation, about the weak points in any large operation, the places where one or two determined people could cause disproportionate damage. "It means we stop playing defense," he said slowly. "Crow wants us to sit here and wait for his next move, to react instead of act. So we don't wait. We go on offense, not against Crow himself, he's too protected, but against his operations. His cattle, his water supplies, his ability to project power across the region." Evelyn's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Guerrilla tactics, hit and fade, make him bleed resources trying to protect everything at once." "Exactly. We can't match his numbers or his money, but we can be a constant thorn, a problem that costs more to solve than it's worth. That's incredibly dangerous. Everything we've done in the last 2 days has been incredibly dangerous." Rhett pulled her close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. "I won't lie and say this is safe or smart, but it's the only play I can see that doesn't end with us running or dead." She was quiet for a long moment, and he could feel her thinking it through, weighing the options with that practical mind that had kept them afloat through drought and depression and every other challenge. "All right," she said finally. "We fight, but we do it smart. No unnecessary risks, no grandstanding. We hurt him enough that backing off becomes more appealing than continuing. Agreed?" "Agreed." They sealed the pact with a kiss that tasted like smoke and determination, and then they sat down to plan the kind of war two people could wage against an empire. The night deepened around Blackthorn Ridge, and somewhere in the darkness, Silas Crow's men were probably watching, waiting, reporting back on the ranchers who dared to defy their boss. Let them watch. Let them report. The war was just beginning, and Rhett Mercer intended to make damn sure it cost Crow more than he ever expected to pay. They waited 3 days before making their first move, and those 3 days nearly broke them. Not from fear, though there was plenty of that, but from the forced inactivity, the constant vigilance that wore nerves raw and made sleep impossible. Every sound after dark brought Rhett to the window with his hand on his gun. Every distant rider on the horizon sent Evelyn to the rifle cabinet. They were living like hunted animals in their own home, and it was exactly what Crow wanted. On the second night, Rhett found Evelyn sitting at the kitchen table long past midnight, cleaning her Winchester for the 3rd time that day. Her hands moved mechanically, but her eyes were somewhere else entirely. "You should sleep," he said. "Can't." She didn't look up from the rifle. "Every time I close my eyes, I see those horses burning, hear them screaming." Rhett sat down across from her, waiting until she finally met his gaze. "That wasn't our fault." "You keep saying that. Doesn't make it true." "Crow gave the order. Crow's men lit the fire. We didn't force Patrick to say no to them, didn't ask him to be a target. We made him one anyway." Evelyn set down the cleaning rod with more force than necessary. "You know what the worst part is? I'd do it again. I'd still ride out there, still ask for help, because the alternative is worse. But that doesn't change the fact that 3 animals died because we're trying to fight someone who will always be willing to hurt more people than we can protect." Rhett had no answer for that, because she was right. Guerrilla tactics only worked if you could stomach the cost, and the cost was always paid by people who had the misfortune of being within reach. "Tomorrow night," he said quietly, "we make our move. Show Crow he's not the only one who can hurt people. And if it goes wrong, then it goes wrong. But at least we're doing something instead of just waiting to be hit again." The 3rd day they spent in preparation, checking equipment and planning routes, and running through the operation until every step was memorized. The target was one of Crow's water stations, a well and pump system that fed his southern pastures. Not critical to his operation, but expensive to replace and positioned far enough from the main compound that it would be lightly guarded. They'd strike at midnight when attention was lowest and darkness provided cover. Get in fast, disable the pump, maybe poison the well for good measure, then disappear before anyone could respond. A pinprick, nothing more, but enough to announce that Crow's infrastructure was vulnerable. As sunset approached on the 3rd day, Rhett saddled both horses while Evelyn gathered their gear. They'd need tools for sabotage, weapons in case things went sideways, and supplies for a cold camp if they had to lay low before returning home. "You remember the escape routes?" Rhett asked as he checked Red's girth. "North to the canyon if we're pursued from the south, east through the scrub if they come from Crow Station, and straight home if it's clear." Evelyn swung into her saddle, settling the Winchester across her lap. "I remember everything, Rhett. Asked me 6 times already. Just making sure. What you're doing is nervous, which is fine. I'm nervous too. But we need to trust each other and trust the plan." She was right, of course. Rhett took a breath, forcing himself to focus. Nerves were natural before action, but they couldn't be allowed to interfere with execution. He'd learned that years ago, had forgotten it during his time as a rancher, and now had to relearn it fast. They rode out as the last light faded from the sky, moving at a steady pace that wouldn't tire the horses but would get them to the target area before midnight. The spring night was cool and clear, stars emerging thick overhead. In different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. The water station sat in a shallow draw about 8 miles south of Blackthorn Ridge, positioned to serve a network of stock ponds that spread across Crow's grazing land. Rhett and Evelyn approached from the east, using the terrain to mask their movement, staying off the main trails where riders might spot them. They tied the horses a 1/4 mile out and continued on foot, Rhett carrying a set of heavy wrenches and a small hammer, Evelyn with her rifle and a bag of salt they'd used to contaminate the well. The pump house appeared ahead, a small wooden structure built over the well shaft, with a windmill standing silent in the still air. No lights, no guards visible. Rhett signaled for Evelyn to stay back and provide cover while he approached the building. The door was unlocked. Why wouldn't it be? Nobody had ever attacked Crow's infrastructure before. Rhett slipped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper darkness. The pump mechanism stood in the center of the small room, all metal gears and leather gaskets, designed to pull water up from deep underground and distribute it through a system of pipes. Rhett set to work with the wrench, loosening the main shaft bolt that held the drive mechanism in place. The metal resisted at first, rusted tight from years of operation, but he applied steady pressure until it started to turn. One rotation, two, three. The bolt came free and he caught it before it could fall and make noise. With the main bolt removed, the drive shaft could be lifted out of its housing, effectively disabling the entire pump. Rhett set it aside and moved to the next component, working methodically to dismantle what he could and damage what he couldn't remove. It took 15 minutes to render the pump completely non-functional. When he was done, Rhett stepped back and examined his work with grim satisfaction. Fixing this would require new parts, specialized knowledge, probably a week of labor at minimum. And every day it stayed broken was a day Crow's cattle went without water in this section of his range. He stepped outside and waved Evelyn forward. She approached quickly, keeping low, the rifle ready. "Done?" she whispered. "Pump's destroyed. Your turn." They moved to the wellhead, where a heavy wooden cover sat over the opening. Rhett lifted it carefully, revealing the dark shaft dropping away into the earth. The smell of cold water rose up, clean and mineral sharp. Evelyn opened the salt bag and poured half of it down the shaft, listening to the crystals scatter against stone as they fell. The salt wouldn't permanently ruin the well. Rain and time would eventually flush it out, but it would make the water undrinkable for months, forcing Crow to either dig a new well or haul water from elsewhere. "That's," Evelyn started to say, then froze. Rhett heard it too. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses coming fast from the direction of Crow Station. "Down!" He pulled Evelyn into the shadow of the pump house, pressing flat against the wooden wall. The rifle felt like an anchor in his hands, solid and reassuring. The riders appeared a minute later, 3 men, maybe 4, hard to tell in the darkness. They pulled up near the well, and Rhett recognized Frank Dalton's voice. "Check the pump house. Someone's been here, I can feel it." Footsteps approached, boots crunching on gravel. Rhett's hand went to his revolver, fingers curling around the grip. If they were spotted now, this would turn into a gunfight, and gunfights meant noise and attention and all the things they'd been trying to avoid. A match flared, illuminating a man's face as he lit a lantern. The light swung toward the pump house entrance, and Rhett tensed, ready to move. Then Evelyn's hand touched his arm, squeezing once. "Trust me." She stepped out from the shadows before Rhett could stop her, rifle pointed at the ground, but ready to swing up in an instant. "Evening, gentlemen," she said calmly. "Beautiful night for a ride." The reaction was immediate. Men scrambling for weapons, horses shying at the sudden movement. Dalton's hand went to his gun, but he didn't draw. Not yet. He was trying to understand what he was seeing, process the fact that Evelyn Mercer was standing in front of Crow's water station like she had every right to be there. "Mrs. Mercer," Dalton's voice was tight with controlled anger. "What are you doing here?" "Could ask you the same question. Though I suspect you're checking on property that's about to need some repairs." Dalton's eyes narrowed, and he gestured to one of his men. "Check the pump." The man dismounted and hurried into the pump house. 30 seconds later, he emerged, his expression confirming what Dalton already suspected. "Torn apart, boss. Somebody knew what they were doing." "And the well?" Rhett stepped out of the shadows then, his matched Colts visible in the lamplight. "Salted. Won't kill anyone, but won't water cattle either. Shame about that." 4 men went for their guns, but Rhett's voice cut through the movement like a blade. "I wouldn't. My wife's got that Winchester pointed at your chest, Dalton, and at this range she doesn't miss. Your boys draw on me. She drops you first. You want to test that?" The standoff crystallized. 4 of Crow's men against 2 people they'd underestimated. Everyone armed, everyone tense. The night suddenly thick with the potential for violence. Dalton slowly raised his hands away from his gun. "You're making a serious mistake, Mercer. Seems like I'm making several. But here's the thing, Dalton. Your boss burned the Brennan's barn, killed their horses, sent a message that scared every independent rancher in the territory. So this is my message back. Crow can come after me directly, or he can watch his empire spring leaks he can't plug fast enough. You can't sabotage every well, every pump, every piece of infrastructure he owns. Don't need to sabotage all of it, just enough to make protecting the rest expensive and exhausting." Rhett's smile was cold. "How many men will Crow station at each water point? How much will that cost in wages and time? And how long before his investors start asking why his operation suddenly requires twice the security for half the output?" Dalton's jaw clenched. "You'll hang for this. Destruction of property, sabotage, criminal conspiracy. Then Crow better have sheriffs who aren't in his pocket. Because last I checked, Texas law frowns on burning people's barns and killing their livestock too. Rhett took a step back, gesturing with his gun. We're leaving now. You're going to stay right here and count to 100. Then you can ride back to Crow Station and explain how 2 people outmaneuvered 4 of his best men. This isn't over, Mercer. Never thought it was. But maybe your boss will think twice before hitting civilians again. Evelyn was already moving toward the horses, walking backward to keep her rifle trained on the group. Rhett followed, matching her pace, his revolver steady in his hands. The men watched them go, anger and humiliation clear on their faces, but nobody moved to follow. They reached the horses and mounted quickly, Rhett keeping his guns out until they were 50 yards away and the darkness had swallowed them. Then he holstered the Colts and gave Red his head, letting the gelding pick the fastest safe route through the broken terrain. Behind them, lamplight still glowed at the water station, and Rhett could imagine Dalton's rage, the calculations he'd be making about pursuit and response. But pursuing riders in darkness through country they didn't know well was a recipe for broken legs and lost men. Dalton was too professional for that. They rode hard for an hour before slowing to let the horses breathe. Evelyn pulled up beside Rhett, her face flushed with adrenaline and something that might have been satisfaction. That went better than expected, she said. That went terribly. We were supposed to be in and out without being seen. But we weren't seen until after the job was done. And we got away clean. I call that a win. Rhett couldn't argue with her logic, even if his nerves were still singing with leftover tension. They'd accomplished the mission, sent their message, and survived the encounter. In the morning, Crow would wake up to find one of his water stations destroyed, and his men reporting that the Mercers had done it openly, deliberately, as a calculated insult. The question was what Crow would do about it. They reached Blackthorn Ridge well after midnight, exhausted and wired at the same time. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind the shakes and the need to process what they'd just done. Rhett unsaddled Red with hands that trembled slightly, while Evelyn tended her mare with the same mechanical precision. Inside the house, they sat at the table without speaking for a long time. The enormity of the night's work was settling in, not the sabotage itself, but the declaration it represented. They'd crossed a line from defensive posturing to active aggression, from resisting Crow's expansion to attacking his interests directly. He'll retaliate, Evelyn said finally. Yes. Harder than the Brennans, more personal. Probably. She looked at him with eyes that held no regret, only determination. Good. Let him come here instead of hurting people who can't fight back. Rhett reached across the table and took her hand. You were supposed to stay hidden tonight, provide cover from distance. Instead, you walked right out into the open. They would have found you in another minute. This way we controlled the encounter. She squeezed his fingers. You would have done the same. Doesn't mean I have to like it. No, but you'll get used to it. We're in this together, remember? That means sharing the risk, not you taking it all while I hide in the shadows. They went to bed as dawn approached, too tired to do more than collapse fully clothed on top of the blankets. Rhett's last thought before exhaustion claimed him was that they'd bought themselves time, maybe days, maybe only hours, before Crow's response arrived. The response came at noon the next day, but not in the form they'd expected. Rhett was repairing a section of fence when he saw the rider approaching. Not multiple men this time, just one. A boy, really, probably 14 or 15, riding a horse that looked too good for a messenger but too worn for a casual visit. Rhett set down his tools and walked to meet the rider, his hand resting on his gun out of habit. The boy pulled up 20 feet away, looking nervous but determined. You Rhett Mercer? I am. Who's asking? My name's Danny. Danny Brennan. The boy's voice cracked slightly on the last name. My father sent me with a message. Rhett's stomach tightened. Patrick Brennan sending his son meant the message was either too important or too dangerous to deliver in person. Go ahead. Danny swallowed hard. Last night, men came to our place again. Said they knew you'd hit one of Crow's water stations. Said Crow wanted you to know that every time you damage his property, he'll damage someone else's. They gave my father a choice. Help them find you or watch the house burn this time instead of just the barn. What did your father say? Told them to go to hell. A flash of pride crossed the boy's face. Said he might not like what you're doing, but he won't be Crow's hunting dog either. So they left. But they promised they'd be back in 3 days, and if my father didn't have information about your movements by then, they'd make good on the threat. Rhett closed his eyes briefly. So this was Crow's play. Turn the victims into informants, make them choose between betraying their neighbors or losing everything. It was cruel and efficient, exactly the kind of tactic that had built his empire. Your father shouldn't have refused them, Rhett said quietly. Should have told them yes, then sent you here to warn me. Would have been safer. He thought of that. But he said once you start lying to men like Crow, you never stop. Better to stand firm from the start. Danny shifted in his saddle. He also said to tell you he still doesn't want your alliance, but he won't work against you either. And if Crow burns our house, he hopes you make the bastard pay for it. Despite everything, Rhett smiled. Your father's a good man. Stubborn, but good. He said the same thing about you, only he used different words. Danny started to turn his horse, then paused. Mr. Mercer, my sisters and my mother, they're scared. We all are. If Crow comes back and my father won't give him what he wants, I know. Rhett wished he had something more reassuring to offer, some guarantee that the Brennans would be safe. But guarantees were luxuries he couldn't afford. Tell your father to be ready, keep guns loaded, animals near the house where you can see them, and someone awake at all times. And if Crow's men show up again, send someone here immediately. We might not be able to stop what happens, but we'll make sure it doesn't go unanswered. Danny nodded and rode off, his young back straight with the kind of courage that came from having no choice but to be brave. Rhett watched him disappear over the ridge, then turned back to the fence he'd been repairing. Evelyn appeared from the house, having seen the exchange from the window. Trouble? Crow's putting pressure on the Brennans again, using them to get to us. So we back off, stop hitting his infrastructure, let things cool down. And then what? He still wants our land? He's still expanding. We just proved we can hurt him, and now he knows we're willing to. Backing off now would be worse than never starting. Evelyn leaned against the fence post, staring out at the land they'd worked so hard to build. There has to be a way to fight him without getting everyone around us killed. If there is, I haven't found it. Rhett picked up his tools, but his hands were shaking too badly to work effectively. Every option is terrible. We keep hitting him, he keeps hitting innocents. We stop, he wins by default. We run, and the next person who tries to resist faces the same choice. Then we change the target. Evelyn's voice was thoughtful, the tone she got when an idea was forming. We've been going after his infrastructure, his water and equipment. But those are just things. Expensive things, but things. What if we went after what he actually cares about? Which is? His reputation. His image as the man who always wins, who always gets what he wants. She turned to face Rhett directly. You said it yourself at Crow Station. He's built his empire on fear and money. People sell to him because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. Investors back him because he seems invincible. What happens if that image cracks? Rhett considered that. You're talking about embarrassing him, making him look weak. More than that. Making him look like what he is. A bully who only wins because nobody's ever stood up properly. You faced him down in his own compound. We sabotaged his water station while his men watched. Those are cracks already. We just need to make them bigger. How? Evelyn smiled, sharp and dangerous. By doing what you did at Crow Station, but in front of witnesses who'll talk, in front of his investors, his business partners, the people whose money and support keeps his empire running. Make him look incompetent or out of control, and suddenly all those people start wondering if they've backed the wrong man. It was audacious, possibly insane, but Rhett could see the logic. Crow's power was built on perception, the perception that he was unstoppable, that crossing him was futile. Break that perception publicly, and the foundation of his empire started to crumble. The cattle auction, Rhett said slowly. Next week in town. Crow always attends, always makes a show of buying the best stock, demonstrating his wealth. Half the ranchers and investors in the territory will be there. Perfect venue. Public, well-attended, impossible for him to control completely. And what exactly do we do there? Challenge him to a duel in the town square? Nothing so dramatic. We just show up. Make it clear we're not hiding, not afraid. Maybe have a conversation with some of his investors about what kind of man they're backing. Evelyn's smile widened. Let people see that we're still standing despite everything he's thrown at us. That might be enough to plant doubts. Rhett thought it through, looking for the flaws. There were plenty. Crow could have them arrested on trumped-up charges, could have men waiting to attack them, could simply refuse to engage and make them look foolish. But there was also potential. Not for victory, but for shifting the narrative in ways that mattered. "All right," he said, "we go to the auction, but we go prepared for trouble and we don't take unnecessary risks. First sign that things are turning bad, we leave." Agreed. They spent the next several days in uneasy calm, waiting for Crow's next move while preparing for the auction. Rhett cleaned his guns until they gleamed, practiced his draw until the movement was pure muscle memory. Evelyn sewed a hidden pocket into her dress for a derringer, practiced walking with the Winchester concealed under a long coat. Word came through the local grapevine that Crow had stationed guards at all his water points, doubled patrols on his property, and put a price on information about the Mercers' activities. The man who'd sabotaged the pump was being portrayed as a dangerous radical, a threat to property and order. Rhett took grim satisfaction in that. If Crow was reacting defensively, assigning resources to protection instead of expansion, then the strategy was working. Not enough to win, but enough to matter. On the third day after Danny Brennan's visit, another rider came, this time Marcus Webb, looking older and more tired than when Rhett had visited him. "Heard what you did to Crow's water station," Webb said without preamble. "Heard he's threatening the Brennans over it. News travels fast. Always does in small territory." Webb dismounted stiffly, and Rhett noticed he was armed more heavily than necessary for a simple visit. "Came to tell you I was wrong." "About what?" "About staying neutral, staying out of your fight. Watched what you're doing, watched how Crow's responding, and I realized something." Webb's weathered face was grim. "He's scared. Maybe not running away scared, but nervous enough to overreact. And men who are scared make mistakes." "You want in?" Rhett asked carefully. "Not in the way you're thinking. I'm too old to be riding around sabotaging wells or facing down gunmen, but I can provide information. I still know most of the old-timers in this region, the ones who remember what it was like before Crow arrived, and some of them are getting tired of being pushed around. Information's good. Better than good, actually." Rhett extended his hand and Webb shook it with a grip still strong despite his years. "Anything you hear about Crow's movements, his plans, where his men are stationed, that all helps. I'll keep my ears open." "And Mercer?" Webb's eyes held something that might have been respect. "Don't get yourself killed doing this. Would be a shame to lose the first person with enough spine to actually fight back." After Webb left, Evelyn came out to stand beside Rhett on the porch. "We're building something," she said quietly. "Maybe not the alliance we originally wanted, but something. People who'll share information, who won't actively help Crow even if they won't fight him directly. It's not much. It's more than we had a week ago, and it's more than Crow expected us to have." The day of the cattle auction arrived with clear skies and a wind that carried the smell of spring growth. Rhett dressed carefully, clean clothes, his matched Colts prominent on his hips, hat brushed and shaped. He wanted to look like a rancher, but also like someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated. Evelyn wore her best dress, dark blue with white trim, and carried herself with the calm confidence that made men underestimate her right up until she proved them wrong. The derringer was hidden in her pocket, the Winchester wrapped in cloth and secured to her saddle. They rode to town together, arriving an hour before the auction started. The main street was already crowded with wagons and horses, ranchers and buyers gathering to examine stock and make deals. The auction grounds were set up on the edge of town, a large corral system where cattle could be viewed and bid on. Rhett spotted Crow immediately. Hard to miss, given the man stood a head taller than most and wore clothes that probably cost more than some of the cattle being sold. He was surrounded by associates, men in city suits who looked uncomfortable in the dust and sun. His investors and business partners, exactly the audience Evelyn had wanted. Crow saw them almost as quickly, and Rhett watched the man's expression shift from surprise to controlled anger. Dalton materialized at Crow's shoulder, saying something too quiet to hear, but his body language screamed alarm. "He didn't expect us to show," Evelyn murmured. "Good. Means we're already off script." They dismounted and tied their horses, then walked slowly into the crowd like they had every right to be there. Which they did. This was a public auction, open to any rancher with money to spend. People noticed them, conversations dropping to whispers as the Mercers passed. Rhett caught fragments, the ones who hit Crow's well, and either brave or stupid, and surprised they're still alive. The story had spread, been embellished probably, but the core remained. Two people had openly defied Silas Crow and survived. An older rancher Rhett recognized vaguely stepped into their path, his weathered face uncertain. "Mercer, heard you've been stirring up trouble." "Heard the same about Crow," Rhett replied easily. "Difference is, his trouble involves burning people's barns." The rancher's eyes flickered to where Crow stood watching. "Be careful who you say that around. Man's got powerful friends." Then his friends should ask themselves what they're supporting. Rhett nodded politely and moved past, Evelyn at his side. They circulated through the crowd, not seeking confrontation but not avoiding attention either. Rhett made small talk about cattle prices, about the spring grazing, about anything except the conflict everyone was thinking about. But his presence alone was making a statement. He wasn't hiding, wasn't running, wasn't acting like a man who expected to lose. The auction started at noon, the auctioneer's voice carrying across the grounds as the first lots of cattle were brought out. Rhett and Evelyn found a spot near the back, close enough to see but with clear exits on multiple sides. Crow dominated the bidding, buying premium stock at premium prices, making a show of his wealth and power. Each successful bid was met with polite applause, the social ritual of business masking the raw competition beneath. Then came a lot that Rhett recognized, 10 head of good breeding stock from a ranch that had recently sold out to Crow. The animals were solid, well-bred, exactly the kind Blackthorn Ridge could use. "I'm bidding on them," Rhett said quietly. Evelyn looked at him sharply. "What? That's insane, I know, but it makes the point. We're not just surviving, we're still operating, still building our ranch. And I want Crow to watch me buy cattle he probably thought he already owned." The bidding started low, a few ranchers testing the waters. Then Crow's voice rang out, confident and commanding, jumping the price significantly. Rhett waited through 2 more bids, then raised his hand. 500. The crowd went silent. Heads turned. Crow's expression darkened. The auctioneer, clearly uncomfortable, acknowledged the bid. 500 to the gentleman in back. "Do I hear 550? 600, Crow said flatly, his eyes locked on Rhett. 650, Rhett countered. This wasn't about the cattle anymore. Both men knew it. This was about dominance, about who would back down in front of witnesses. Crow could outspend Rhett 10 times over, but walking away would look like defeat. 800, Crow said, his voice hard. Rhett hesitated, calculating. 800 was more than the cattle were worth, more than he could comfortably afford. Evelyn's hand touched his arm gently, a reminder that they'd agreed not to take unnecessary risks. 800 going once, the auctioneer called, relief clear in his voice. Going twice. $1,000? Rhett said clearly. The crowd gasped. That was insane money for 10 head of cattle, money that would strain Blackthorn Ridge's finances for months. But the number wasn't about economics. It was about nerve. Crow's face had gone red. Dalton whispered urgently in his ear, but Crow waved him off. 1,500, Crow bid out. And there it was. The moment where Crow had been pushed into overpaying dramatically just to prove he could. Rhett smiled slightly and raised his hands in surrender. The man wants those cattle more than I do. They're his at 1,500. Sold! The auctioneer's gavel came down fast before anyone could change their minds. 1,500 to Mr. Crow. The crowd buzzed with conversation, everyone understanding what they'd just witnessed. Crow had won the bid, but lost something more important. He'd been pushed into a public display of pettiness, forced to spend 3 times what the cattle were worth just to beat a small rancher in a bidding war. One of Crow's investors, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd never been closer to a cow than this auction, leaned over to say something to Crow. The cattle baron's expression suggested the comment wasn't complimentary. Rhett and Evelyn slipped away before Crow could recover, working their way back through the crowd toward their horses. They'd made their statement, shown they weren't afraid, and forced Crow into a public mistake. Time to leave before things turned violent. They were almost to the horses when Dalton stepped into their path, backed by 2 other men Rhett recognized from Crow Station. Going somewhere, Mercer? Home. Got work to do. Unlike some people who get paid to stand around looking threatening. Dalton's hand moved toward his gun, and the crowd around them scattered, people diving for cover. But Evelyn's voice cut through the sudden tension. "I wouldn't, Mr. Dalton. Drawing a gun in front of all these witnesses would make your boss look even worse than he already does. And I suspect he's had about enough embarrassment for one day." Dalton's eyes flickered to where Crow stood, still surrounded by his investors, clearly being peppered with questions about the bidding war. The calculation was visible on Dalton's face. Violence now would confirm everything Rhett and Evelyn were implying about Crow's inability to control situations through legitimate means. "This isn't over," Dalton said, but he stepped aside. "Never thought it was," Rhett replied, and he and Evelyn mounted their horses and rode out of town at a measured pace, not rushing, but not dawdling either. Once they were clear of the main street, Evelyn let out a breath she'd apparently been holding. That was reckless. That was necessary. We needed to show people that Crow bleeds, that he can be pushed, that he's not invincible. And did we? Rhett thought about the investors' faces, about the whispered conversations, about the way Crow had been forced into paying ridiculous money for cattle just to save face. Maybe. Won't know for sure until we see how things play out. But we cracked the facade a little. That's worth something. They rode home as afternoon faded toward evening, and for the first time in days, Rhett felt something like hope stirring beneath the constant tension. They were still outgunned, still fighting an enemy with far superior resources, but they'd proven that intelligence and nerve could overcome raw power, at least temporarily. The question was how long they could keep it up before Crow's patience ran out, and he stopped playing by any rules at all. The retaliation came faster than Rhett expected, and from a direction he hadn't anticipated. 2 days after the auction, Marcus Webb rode into Blackthorn Ridge at dawn, his horse lathered and blowing hard. Rhett met him in the yard, already knowing from the old man's face that whatever news he carried wasn't good. "Crow's moving," Webb said without dismounting. "Got word from a friend who works the saloon near Crow Station. There was a meeting last night, Crow and his investors. Things got heated." "How heated?" "Heated enough that one of them pulled out of a land deal. Said he wasn't comfortable backing expansion that was generating this much controversy and bad publicity." Webb's expression was grim. "Crow blamed you. Said you were a malcontent stirring up trouble, and he needed to make an example that would settle things permanently." Rhett's stomach went cold. "What kind of example?" "The kind that doesn't leave witnesses. My friend heard Dalton being given instructions. Something about a night visit and making sure the problem got solved permanently." Webb finally dismounted, moving stiff from the hard ride. "They're coming tonight, Mercer, and they're not coming to talk." Evelyn appeared from the house, her face pale. She'd clearly heard enough through the open window. "How many men?" "At least 6, maybe more. Dalton plus whoever he trusts for wet work." Webb looked between them. "You need to leave. Right now. Pack what you can carry and ride out before dark. Head north into the territories where Crow's reach doesn't extend." "No." Rhett's voice was flat, final. "Boy, don't be stupid. 6 professional guns against 2 people. No matter how good you are, those aren't odds you can beat. This isn't about pride anymore. This is about survival. It's about more than that." Rhett looked at the house, the barn, the land they'd built from nothing. "If we run, Crow wins. Every rancher who ever thinks about standing up to him will remember that we ran, and they'll fold before they even start. But if we stand, you'll die," Webb interrupted. "Heroically, maybe. Bravely, certainly. But you'll still be dead." Evelyn stepped forward, her jaw set with the same determination Rhett felt. "Maybe we will, but maybe we won't. And either way, it happens on our terms, on our land, fighting for what's ours." Webb stared at them both like they'd lost their minds. "You're not listening to me. This isn't like the water station or the auction. This is an execution dressed up as a raid. Dalton's not coming to intimidate you. He's coming to bury you." "Then he better bring more men," Rhett said quietly. "Because we're not making it easy." The old rancher's shoulders sagged. "I tried. Can't say I didn't try." He moved toward his horse, then paused. "For what it's worth, you've got more guts than sense. But maybe that's what this territory needs. Someone too stubborn to know when they're beaten." After Webb rode off, Rhett and Evelyn stood in the yard as the sun climbed higher, warming the spring air. Birds sang in the cottonwoods. The windmill creaked its familiar rhythm. Everything looked peaceful, normal, like this might be any other morning instead of potentially their last. "We need to prepare," Evelyn said finally, her voice steady despite everything. "If they're coming tonight, We have maybe 12 hours to get ready. We can't defend the whole ranch. Too much ground, too many approaches. Rhett was already running through scenarios, calculating fields of fire and defensive positions. We make the house our fortress, barricade the doors, position ourselves at windows with clear sightlines, and make them come to us. They'll just burn us out. That's what I'd do. Surround the house and set it on fire. Force us out into the open, where they have the advantage. She was right, of course. The house was stone, but the roof was wood and the doors were vulnerable. Even if they survived the initial assault, smoke and fire would drive them out eventually. Then we don't stay in the house, Rhett said slowly, an idea forming. We make them think we're in the house, but we're actually positioned outside in places they won't expect. When they come in for what they think is an easy kill, we hit them from behind. Evelyn's eyes lit with understanding. The barn. It's got clear sightlines to the house, and the loft provides elevation. If we're positioned there with rifles while they're focused on the house, we turn their trap into ours. Rhett nodded, the plan crystallizing. We'll need to make the house look occupied. Lamps lit, maybe some movement visible through the windows. And we need to choose our positions carefully, places where we can retreat if things go wrong. They spent the morning preparing, working with the focused intensity of people who knew their lives depended on getting every detail right. Rhett moved furniture in the house, creating barricades and defensive positions even though they planned to be elsewhere. Let Dalton's men waste time and ammunition shooting at empty rooms. In the barn, they prepared the loft, clearing hay bales to create firing positions with views of the entire yard. Evelyn positioned her Winchester with extra ammunition, testing the angles and distances. From here, she could cover the front approach and both sides of the house. Rhett chose a position in the old storage shed near the corral, the same type of building Evelyn had used at Crow Station. It gave him a different angle than the barn, overlapping fields of fire so they could support each other. The matched Colts were cleaned and loaded, spare ammunition distributed in his pockets. As afternoon faded toward evening, they set up the deception. Lamps were lit in the main room and bedroom, positioned to cast shadows that might look like people moving. They rigged a rope system to occasionally shift curtains, creating the illusion of activity. If this works, we'll have maybe one good volley before they realize where we actually are, Evelyn said as they made final adjustments. After that, it becomes a straight fight. Then we make that first volley count. Rhett checked his revolvers one more time, the familiar weight reassuring in his hands. You remember the plan. Fire discipline, pick targets carefully, fall back to the creek bed if we're overrun. She touched his face gently. And we stick together. That was the promise. That was the promise, he confirmed. They kissed once, quick and fierce, then separated to their positions. Rhett watched Evelyn climb into the barn loft, settling behind her carefully constructed barricade of hay bales. She looked back once, gave him a small wave, then disappeared into shadow. The wait was worse than action, always had been. Rhett sat in the storage shed as twilight deepened into full dark, listening to the night sounds and trying to distinguish normal from threatening. Every rustle of wind through grass made his hand tighten on his gun. Every distant animal sound could have been approaching riders. The moon rose late, just a silver sliver that provided minimal light. Good for the defenders, bad for attackers who'd be moving through unfamiliar terrain. Rhett allowed himself a moment of hope that maybe this could actually work, that maybe they could survive this night and send Crow a message he couldn't ignore. The riders came at midnight, just as Webb had predicted. Rhett heard them before he saw them, the careful sound of horses moving slowly, trying for stealth. 6 riders, maybe 7, spreading out as they approached the ranch buildings. Dalton's voice carried across the yard, pitched low but clear. Remember, the house is stone. Won't burn easy. We go in fast, 2 teams, front and back doors simultaneously. Anyone comes out shooting, you put them down. No prisoners, no witnesses, clean and final. Rhett's jaw tightened. So it was exactly what Webb had warned, not intimidation or property destruction, but murder dressed up as a raid. If they'd been in that house like Dalton expected, they'd be dead in minutes, caught in a coordinated assault with no escape. The men dismounted and moved toward the house, spreading into their assigned positions. Rhett counted heads, 6 total, which meant Dalton had brought his most trusted people. Professional killers, men who'd done this kind of work before. They approached the lit windows cautiously, guns drawn, clearly expecting resistance. One man peered through a window, then gestured to the others. The setup looked right to them. Lights burning, shadows moving, targets waiting inside. Dalton raised his hand, counting down silently. 3, 2, 1. Both doors exploded inward simultaneously, men pouring through with weapons ready. Gunfire erupted immediately. The attackers shooting at the furniture arrangements Rhett had carefully positioned to look like defensive positions. "Now," Rhett whispered, though Evelyn couldn't hear him. The Winchester cracked from the barn loft, the sound sharp and clear in the night air. One of Dalton's men dropped immediately, clutching his leg and screaming. The others spun, confused, trying to locate the source of fire that had come from the wrong direction. Rhett opened up with his revolvers, firing carefully from the storage shed. Another man went down, this one staying down. The remaining attackers scattered, diving for cover, suddenly realizing they'd walked into an ambush instead of springing one. "The barn!" someone shouted. "She's in the barn!" 3 men turned their attention toward Evelyn's position, laying down suppressing fire while moving to flank her. But that exposed them to Rhett's angle, and he punished the mistake with precision fire that drove them back toward the house. Dalton was shouting orders, trying to regain control of a situation that had turned against him. "Find them! Pin them down! We still have numbers!" But numbers meant less when your enemy knew the terrain and had chosen the battleground. Rhett shifted position within the shed, using the interior support post for cover as return fire splintered wood around him. His revolvers barked steadily, not trying for kills necessarily, but keeping the attackers suppressed and confused. Evelyn's Winchester sang its rhythm from the barn. Careful, measured shots that spoke of a marksman who didn't waste ammunition. Another of Dalton's men went down with a cry, dragging himself behind the water trough. The attackers were trying to coordinate to use their superior numbers to overwhelm the defenders' positions. But they were operating in darkness on unfamiliar ground while taking fire from 2 directions, and their coordination was falling apart. One of Dalton's men made a break for the horses, apparently deciding this job wasn't worth dying for. Rhett let him go. One less gun to worry about. But Dalton saw the desertion and his voice turned savage. "Stand and fight! We finish this tonight!" He led a charge toward the barn, 3 men following, clearly deciding to eliminate Evelyn's superior position. Rhett's heart lurched. They'd split up exactly as he'd feared, dividing their defensive capability. He burst from the storage shed at a run, crossing open ground toward the barn. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet, one passing close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. He fired as he ran, not aiming properly, but creating enough threat that the men behind cover had to keep their heads down. Dalton reached the barn door and kicked it open, disappearing inside with 2 men behind him. Rhett heard Evelyn's Winchester boom once from above, heard a man scream, then the sound of struggle and shouting. Rhett hit the barn door at full speed, his revolvers up and tracking. The interior was dark except for moonlight filtering through cracks in the walls. One of Dalton's men was down at the base of the ladder leading to the loft, unmoving. The other was climbing up, going after Evelyn. Rhett shot him twice in the back, hating it, but not hesitating. The man fell, tumbling from the ladder to land in a heap. Above, he could hear the sounds of close combat. Evelyn had abandoned the rifle for closer weapons. Dalton's voice cut through the noise. "Got you now, bitch! Should have stayed home instead of playing soldier." Rhett vaulted up the ladder, taking the rungs 3 at a time. He emerged into the loft just as Dalton grabbed Evelyn by the throat, using his size and strength to force her back against the hay bales. Her face was bruised, blood running from a split lip, but her eyes blazed with fury. "Let her go," Rhett said, both revolvers pointed at Dalton's head. Dalton shifted, using Evelyn as a shield. "I don't think so. I think we're going to walk out of here together, and you're going to let us. Because if you shoot, you might hit her. And I know you're not willing to take that chance." He was right, and they both knew it. At this range, with Evelyn struggling and Dalton moving, the risk of hitting her was too high. "You can't win this," Rhett said, keeping his voice steady. "Half your men are down or run off. You walk out of here now, this ends. Keep pushing, and you'll be the one who doesn't leave. I don't make deals with people like you." Dalton's grip on Evelyn's throat tightened, making her gasp. "Crow wants you dead, and I intend to deliver. Question is whether your wife dies first or if you get to watch." Evelyn's hand moved, subtle and quick, pulling the derringer from her dress pocket. She jammed it under Dalton's ribs and pulled the trigger without hesitation. The small gun's report was surprisingly loud in the enclosed space. Dalton's eyes went wide with shock, his grip on Evelyn loosening. She shoved him away hard, and he stumbled backward, clutching the wound. Rhett's revolvers tracked him, but Dalton was already falling, his legs giving out. He hit the loft floor hard, gasping for breath. "You shot me," he said, sounding genuinely surprised. "That little bitch actually shot me." Evelyn stood over him, the derringer still in her hand. "You put your hands on me twice. Once was forgivable. Twice was stupid." Outside, the remaining attackers were calling out, their voices uncertain. They'd heard the gunshot, heard their leader fall, and now they were calculating whether continuing this fight was worth it without Dalton's leadership. Rhett moved to the loft opening, looking down at the yard. 3 men were still standing, gathered near the water trough, clearly debating their options. He didn't give them time to decide. "Dalton's down!" he shouted. "You've got 2 choices. Ride out now and live, or stay and see how this ends. We've got elevation, we've got ammunition, and we've got nothing to lose. You're working for pay. Is it enough to die for?" The silence stretched out, broken only by Dalton's labored breathing behind him. Then one of the men stood, hands visible and empty. "We're done. This wasn't supposed to be a war, just a job. Dalton led us wrong." He started backing toward the horses. "We're leaving. You don't shoot us, we don't shoot you. Fair?" "Fair," Rhett confirmed. "Take your wounded if you can carry them. Leave the dead for now. We'll handle them proper." The 3 men moved quickly, gathering the wounded and making for their horses. Within minutes, they were mounted and riding off into the darkness, leaving behind the chaos of the failed raid. Rhett turned back to where Evelyn stood over Dalton. The man was still alive, but his breathing was shallow and wet-sounding. The derringer had done serious damage at close range. "You need a doctor," Evelyn said, her voice empty of sympathy. "Need revenge," Dalton managed. "Crow won't stop. You think this changes anything?" "It changes one thing," Rhett said, kneeling beside him. "It proves you're not invincible. Proves Crow's money can't buy him immunity from consequences. And every person who hears about tonight will know that standing up to him is possible." Dalton laughed, a wet sound that turned into coughing. "Fools hope. He'll just send more men, better men. Won't stop until you're dead. Maybe. But we'll still be here tomorrow. Can you say the same?" Dalton's eyes were starting to glaze, shock and blood loss taking their toll. "Should have killed you that first day. Should have burned this place with you inside." "Should have," Evelyn agreed. "But you didn't, and that mistake is going to cost your boss everything he built." They bound Dalton's wound as best they could and got him down from the loft, though he was fading fast. Rhett hitched a horse to their wagon and loaded Dalton into the bed, knowing the man probably wouldn't survive the trip to town, but unable to just let him bleed out. "I'll drive him to the doctor," Evelyn said, climbing into the wagon seat. "You stay here, secure the property, make sure there aren't any stragglers waiting to take a shot." "We should stay together." "And leave the ranch undefended?" "No, this needs doing, and one of us needs to be here." She looked down at him, her face still showing the marks of Dalton's attack. "I'll be back before dawn. Keep a light burning." Rhett wanted to argue, but she was right. He helped her get the wagon moving, watched until it disappeared into the darkness, then turned back to survey the damage. Bosom. 2 men dead in the yard, 1 in the barn, blood staining the dirt, bullet holes pocking the buildings. The physical evidence of violence that would need explaining, cleaning, dealing with. But they'd won. Against superior numbers and professional killers, they'd won. Rhett spent the next hours doing the grim work of warfare, moving bodies, securing weapons, checking for wounded they might have missed. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving exhaustion and pain from injuries he hadn't noticed during the fight. A graze across his shoulder, bruised ribs from diving behind cover, hands scraped raw. He was sitting on the porch cleaning his revolvers by lamplight when Evelyn returned just before dawn. She looked exhausted, her dress stained with blood, Dalton's probably from riding in the wagon with him. "How is he?" Rhett asked. "Alive when I left him with the doctor. Whether he stays that way," she shrugged. "The doctor said it could go either way. But everyone in town knows now. Knows Crow sent men to kill us, knows they failed, knows we fought back and won." "That'll stir things up." "Already has." While the doctor was working, people were gathering outside, asking questions. Some of them looked scared, but some, she smiled slightly, some looked hopeful, like maybe the big man isn't so big after all. They sat together on the porch as the sun rose, painting Blackthorn Ridge in shades of gold and red. The land looked the same as always, beautiful, peaceful, worth fighting for. But something had fundamentally shifted in the night just past. Crow will come himself now, Evelyn said quietly. This was too public, too embarrassing. He'll have to respond personally or look weak. I know. Rhett stared out at the horizon. But he'll also know we're not easy targets, that we can fight, that we can win. Maybe that'll make him think twice. Or maybe it'll just make him angry enough to throw everything he has at us. Maybe. Rhett took her hand, feeling the calluses from ranch work, the strength in her grip. But whatever comes next, we face it together. And we do it from here, from our land, on our terms. The sun continued its climb, burning away the morning mist. In the distance, a rider appeared on the ridge, Marcus Webb, coming to check on them, to see if they'd survived the night. Behind him would be others, people who'd heard the news, who'd come to see for themselves that resistance was possible. The war with Silas Crow wasn't over. It had barely begun. But for the first time since this whole thing started, Rhett felt like maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Webb dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the bullet-scarred buildings, the dark stains in the yard that spoke of violence. He looked older this morning, worn down by a night of waiting to see if his warning had come too late. "You're alive," he said, and there was genuine relief in his voice. More or less. Rhett stood, wincing at the stiffness in his ribs. Dalton brought 6 men, 3 dead, 2 wounded, 1 ran. Dalton himself is with the doctor in town, 50-50 on whether he makes it. Webb let out a low whistle. "You beat them. You actually beat them." "We survived," Evelyn corrected. "That's not quite the same thing." But word was already spreading, carried by the men who'd fled and the people who'd seen Evelyn deliver a bleeding Dalton to the doctor in the pre-dawn hours. By noon, riders were arriving at Blackthorn Ridge, not to attack, but to see for themselves. Marcus Webb had been first, but others followed. Sarah Chen came, the quiet woman who'd inherited her father's ranch and refused every offer to sell. She brought food and medical supplies, her face serious. "I heard what happened. Wanted to make sure you had what you needed." Patrick Brennan arrived with his 2 oldest sons, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Didn't come to apologize," he said gruffly, "but I wanted you to know what you did last night, standing your ground like that. It matters. Makes a man think maybe running isn't the only option." By late afternoon, a dozen ranchers had passed through, some offering help, others just bearing witness. The story was growing with each telling, 2 people against 6 professional killers, winning through courage and strategy. It wasn't entirely accurate, but the truth underneath was solid enough. What surprised Rhett most was who didn't come. No sheriff, no law, no official response to what had been a clear attempt at murder. That told him everything about how deep Crow's influence ran in this territory, how completely he'd captured the mechanisms that were supposed to protect people. "The law won't help us," he said to Evelyn that evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over land they'd nearly died defending. "If anything, they'll probably try to arrest us for defending ourselves. Then we don't wait for the law." Evelyn's voice was quiet but firm. "We take this straight to Crow, end it before he can regroup and send more men. Just ride to Crow Station again? After what happened last night, that place will be locked down tight. Not Crow Station. Town. He'll have to show his face eventually, have to conduct business, have to maintain the appearance that everything's under control." She turned to look at him. "And when he does, we confront him publicly. Make him answer for sending killers to our home. Make him explain to all those investors and business partners why his attempt to murder us failed." Rhett considered that. It was risky, potentially suicidal, but it had one advantage. Crow couldn't afford another public embarrassment. The auction had cracked his facade of invincibility. The failed raid had shattered it further. One more blow, delivered in front of the right people, might topple the entire empire. "We'd need to know when he's coming to town," Rhett said. "Need witnesses, people who matter. Webb might know. He's got connections, people who owe him favors." They found Webb the next morning at his ranch, and he listened to their plan with the expression of a man watching friends walk toward a cliff. "You're asking me to help you commit suicide," he said finally. "We're asking you to help us end this." Rhett leaned forward. Crow's built his power on fear and the appearance of strength. Every time we've faced him publicly, that appearance has cracked a little more. One more confrontation, the right confrontation, and people will see him for what he really is, a bully who only wins when nobody fights back. Webb was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers. There's a cattle buyer coming through next week, big operation out of Kansas City. Crow's been courting them for months, trying to secure a contract for his beef. They're meeting in town at the hotel. Crow will be there, along with half the business community. He'll want to look successful, in control, worth investing in. Perfect, Evelyn said. Perfect for getting yourselves killed, Webb corrected. You walk into that hotel, Crow will have you arrested, or shot, or both. Maybe, but he'll have to do it in front of witnesses who aren't on his payroll, investors, buyers, people from outside this territory who won't be impressed by local strong-arm tactics. Rhett stood. We're doing this, Webb. The only question is whether you'll help us know when and where. The old rancher sighed. Next Thursday, 2 o'clock at the Grand Hotel. And for the record, I think you're both insane. But you're the right kind of insane, the kind this territory needs. He paused. I'll be there too. In the hotel bar, watching. Won't be able to help directly, but at least there'll be one friendly face in the crowd. The week that followed felt longer than the previous month combined. Rhett and Evelyn prepared meticulously, not for violence, but for theater. They cleaned their best clothes, practiced what they'd say, rehearsed how they'd handle different scenarios. The matched Colt stayed home. Walking into that hotel armed would give Crow the excuse he needed to have them arrested or shot. We're betting everything on him caring more about his reputation than his revenge, Evelyn said the night before the confrontation. He's a businessman first. Revenge is expensive and unpredictable. Bad for business. Rhett hoped he sounded more confident than he felt. We just need to make it clear that continuing this fight will cost him more than walking away. Thursday arrived with clear skies and a wind that smelled of rain coming. They dressed carefully. Rhett in his best suit, rarely worn since their wedding. Evelyn in a dress that was elegant but practical, her hair pinned up in a way that made her look both refined and formidable. The ride to town was quiet, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts. This was it, the moment where they either broke Crow's grip on the territory or destroyed themselves trying. There was no middle ground, no compromise available. Win or lose, everything would be decided in the next few hours. The Grand Hotel dominated the town's main street, 3 stories of whitewashed wood and glass windows that spoke of prosperity and civilization. Expensive horses were tied outside, and well-dressed men moved through the entrance, conducting the business that kept the territory running. Rhett and Evelyn tied their horses and paused at the entrance, hands finding each other briefly. Together, Evelyn said. Together, Rhett confirmed, and they walked through the doors like they owned the place. The lobby was crowded with ranchers, buyers, businessmen, all the machinery of commerce that Crow depended on. Rhett spotted him immediately, hard to miss, standing with a group of suited men near the main staircase, clearly in the middle of some important conversation. Crow saw them almost as quickly, and his expression went from surprise to fury to calculation in the space of a heartbeat. He said something to the men around him, then started toward Rhett and Evelyn, Dalton's replacement, a hard-faced man named Carson, flanking him. Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer. Crow's voice was controlled, almost friendly, but his eyes were cold. This is unexpected. I wasn't aware you had business in town today. We have business with you, Rhett said clearly, his voice carrying across the lobby. Conversation stopped. People turned to watch. Crow's jaw tightened. Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private. No, we're done with private conversations and midnight visits. This discussion happens right here, right now, in front of everyone. The lobby was silent now, every eye on this confrontation. Rhett could see the cattle buyers Webb had mentioned, distinguished-looking men in expensive suits, watching with interest. This was the audience they needed. Very well. Crow spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. What seems to be the problem? The problem is you sent 6 men to kill us last week. 6 armed killers led by Frank Dalton, with orders to make sure we didn't survive the night. Rhett kept his voice level, factual. 3 of them died. Dalton's still recovering from the bullet my wife put in him. The others ran. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. One of the cattle buyers leaned toward his associate, whispering urgently. Crow's expression remained calm, but Rhett could see the tension in his shoulders. That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof? We have Dalton, currently under the doctor's care with a gunshot wound. We have the bodies of the men who died on our property. We have witnesses who saw my wife bring Dalton to town, bleeding from a confrontation he initiated. Evelyn stepped forward. But more than that, we have the pattern. You wanted our land. We refused to sell. You sent men to intimidate us. That failed. You burned our neighbor's barn. Then you sent killers when everything else didn't work. Even if what you say is true, and I'm not conceding that it is, men like Dalton act on their own initiative sometimes. I can't be held responsible for every decision my employees make. You're responsible for the culture you create. Rhett's voice hardened. You've built an empire on fear and intimidation. Everyone in this room knows it. The question is whether these gentlemen from Kansas City want to do business with a man who settles disputes with arson and murder. One of the cattle buyers spoke up, his accent marking him as northern. Is this true, Mr. Crow? Are you involved in this kind of activity? Of course not. These are simply disgruntled neighbors making wild accusations because I made them a fair offer for property they're failing to manage properly. Crow's voice was smooth, dismissive. The Mercers are trying to extort additional money by manufacturing scandal. We don't want your money, Evelyn said quietly. We never did. We just want to be left alone to work our land in peace. But you can't accept that anyone would refuse you, so you escalate and threaten and ultimately send men with guns. Prove it, Crow challenged. Prove I gave any such order. Rhett smiled slightly. We don't have to prove it in court. We just have to prove it to the people whose money and support keeps your empire running. And we've done that. Everyone in this room now knows that working with you means accepting violence as a business tool. Some of them might be fine with that, but others, he looked directly at the cattle buyers, others might prefer partners who settle disputes through law and negotiation rather than midnight raids. The lead buyer's expression was troubled. Mr. Crow, I think my associates and I need to discuss this development. Perhaps we should postpone our meeting until matters are more settled. That's not necessary, Crow said quickly, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. These accusations are baseless. They're not baseless if everyone believes them, Rhett interrupted. That's the problem with building power on reputation. Once that reputation cracks, the power crumbles with it. And your reputation just cracked wide open. Crow's control finally snapped. You arrogant son of a bitch. You think you can walk in here, destroy years of work, ruin business relationships, and just walk away? You think I'll let that happen? What are you going to do? Evelyn asked calmly. Have a shot in front of all these witnesses? That would certainly help your business prospects. Carson's hand moved toward his gun, but Crow grabbed his arm, stopping him. For the first time, Rhett saw real fear in the cattle baron's eyes. Not fear of violence, but fear of losing everything he'd built. You've already lost, Crow, Rhett said quietly. For his ears only. Maybe not everything. Maybe not today. But we've shown people that you can be beaten, that standing up to you is possible. And once people know that, your empire starts dying whether you admit it or not. Crow's face had gone pale, his composure completely shattered. Around them, the crowd was buzzing with conversation. Business partners were reconsidering relationships. Investors were calculating risks. The machinery of Crow's power was coming apart in real time. The cattle buyer cleared his throat. Mr. Crow, I think we'll be returning to Kansas City without finalizing any agreements. We prefer to do business in more stable situations. Wait, Crow started, but the buyers were already moving toward the door, their decision made. Other men followed, business associates suddenly remembering appointments elsewhere, investors finding reasons to distance themselves from a man who'd just been publicly accused of attempted murder. In less than 5 minutes, Crow went from the center of a business empire to standing nearly alone in a hotel lobby with only his hired man and a few die-hard supporters. Rhett and Evelyn turned to leave, their work done. But Crow's voice stopped them. This isn't over, Mercer. You think you've won, but all you've done is make an enemy who won't stop until you're destroyed. Rhett looked back at him, this man who'd seemed so powerful just days ago and now looked diminished, almost pathetic. You're right about one thing. It's not over. But it's not the fight you think it is. This was never about beating you. It was about showing people they don't have to be afraid. And we've done that. What happens to you now is just the consequence of your own choices. They walked out of the hotel into afternoon sunshine, and the change in atmosphere was immediate. People on the street looked at them differently, not with fear or pity, but with something like respect. Word had already spread from the hotel, carried by the witnesses who'd seen Crow's empire crack. Webb was waiting by their horses, a smile creasing his weathered face. Heard it went well. Went exactly as planned, Evelyn said, which is frankly surprising given how many things could have gone wrong. What happens now? Webb asked. Now we go home, Rhett said, untying Red's reins. We've said what needed saying, done what needed doing. The rest is up to Crow. He can keep fighting a losing battle, or he can accept that this territory isn't his personal kingdom anymore. They rode back to Blackthorn Ridge as the sun angled toward evening, and for the first time in weeks, the tension that had been riding Rhett's shoulders began to ease. Not disappear. He wasn't naive enough to think Crow would give up entirely, but ease enough that he could breathe without feeling like he was waiting for the next attack. The ranch appeared below them as they crested the final rise, the house and barn solid and familiar. Home. Worth everything they'd risked, everything they'd endured. Over the following weeks, the change became undeniable. Crow's business empire didn't collapse overnight. These things never did, but it began a slow, steady decline. Investors pulled out. Business partners found other suppliers. The reputation that had been his greatest asset became a liability as people reassessed what supporting him actually meant. More importantly, other ranchers started standing firm. When Crow made offers on neighboring properties, the owners refused without fear. When his men came around making threats, people reported them to authorities who suddenly felt brave enough to act now that Crow's invincibility had been disproven. Patrick Brennan rebuilt his barn, and this time when Crow's men rode past his property, they kept riding. Sarah Chen expanded her operation, buying cattle at prices she could afford now that Crow wasn't artificially inflating the market. Marcus Webb started talking about maybe working his land another few years instead of selling out and retiring. The territory was changing, and Rhett and Evelyn had been the catalyst. 1 month after the confrontation at the hotel, a rider arrived at Blackthorn Ridge carrying papers. Not threats this time, but legal documents transferring water rights and settling boundary disputes. Crow's lawyer had drawn them up, and they formalized what everyone already knew. Blackthorn Ridge was staying in Mercer hands, permanently and without further contest. There was no personal note, no acknowledgement of defeat, just the papers and a wax seal making it official. He's done fighting, Evelyn said, reading through the documents. This is his surrender, even if he'd never call it that. Rhett wasn't so sure. Men like Crow didn't surrender. They retreated to regroup, to find new angles, to wait for better opportunities. But the immediate threat was over, and that was something worth celebrating. That evening, they sat on the porch as they had so many times before, watching the sunset paint the Texas hills in gold and purple. The wind carried the smell of new grass and cattle and all the familiar scents of ranch life. Everything looked peaceful, normal, like the violence and fear of the past weeks had been a fever dream. Do you think it was worth it? Evelyn asked quietly. Everything we risked? Everything we went through? Rhett thought about that carefully, about the nights without sleep and the constant fear, and the moment in the barn when Dalton had his hands on Evelyn's throat. He thought about Patrick Brennan's barn burning and the bodies in their yard and all the costs that had been paid. I think it was necessary, he said finally. Worth it implies we had a choice. But we didn't, not really. Stay and fight, or run and spend the rest of our lives wondering what would have happened if we'd stood our ground. At least this way we know. And what do we know? That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. That two people who refuse to break can sometimes move mountains. That empires built on fear and money are more fragile than they look. He took her hand. And that fighting for what's yours, even against impossible odds, is better than giving it up without trying. Evelyn leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as darkness crept across the land. Somewhere in that darkness, Silas Crow was probably planning his next move, calculating how to rebuild what had been lost. But that was a problem for another day. Tonight, Blackthorn Ridge was theirs, truly and completely. The deed was secure. The land was safe. The water rights were protected. They'd survived everything Crow had thrown at them and come out standing. You know what the strange part is? Evelyn said. I don't hate him. Crow, I mean. He did terrible things, hurt people, nearly got us killed. But mostly I just feel sorry for him. Sorry for him? He built this huge empire, accumulated all this power and money, and for what? In the end, it couldn't buy him the one thing he actually wanted, our land. All that wealth and influence, and he still lost to two people with nothing but stubbornness and principle. She shook her head. That's got to eat at him. Knowing he was beaten by people who had less of everything except will. Rhett considered that. She was right, in a way. Crow had approached this like a business transaction, assuming everything had a price. He'd never understood that some things, home, dignity, the right to stand on your own land without fear, those things weren't for sale at any price. Maybe that's the lesson, Rhett said. That power and money can buy a lot, but they can't buy courage. And in the end, that's what matters. Not how big your empire is, but whether you can look yourself in the mirror and know you stood for something worth standing for. The weeks turned into months, and life at Blackthorn Ridge settled into new rhythms. The bullet holes in the buildings were repaired. The blood stains in the yard faded with rain and sun. The physical scars of the conflict healed, though the emotional ones remained. Rhett still woke some nights reaching for his guns, still scanned horizons for riders that never came. But they were building something new now, something better than what they'd had before. Other ranchers stopped by regularly, sharing information and resources. An informal network developed, not quite the formal alliance Rhett had originally envisioned, but something more organic and lasting. People looking out for each other, watching each other's backs, making sure no one had to face threats alone. Sarah Chen brought her first successful calf crop to show them, pride evident in every word. Marcus Webb started hosting monthly gatherings where ranchers could meet and discuss common concerns. Patrick Brennan's sons learned to shoot from Evelyn, who turned out to have a gift for teaching. The territory was knitting itself together in ways that hadn't been possible when everyone was isolated and afraid. And at the center of it, whether they'd intended to be or not, were Rhett and Evelyn Mercer, the couple who'd refused to back down and shown others that refusal was possible. 6 months after the confrontation at the hotel, word came that Crow was selling off portions of his holdings, consolidating around his core properties. The empire was shrinking, the expansion halted. Some people said he was planning to leave Texas entirely, to try his luck in other territories where his reputation hadn't been damaged. Rhett heard the news without satisfaction or regret. Crow's fate was Crow's problem now. What mattered was that the threat had passed, that families could work their land without fear, that the territory had a chance to develop in healthier directions. One evening, as autumn painted the hills in shades of red and gold, Evelyn found Rhett in the barn, working on a saddle that needed mending. She watched him for a moment before speaking. "I'm pregnant." Rhett's hand stilled on the leather. He looked up at her, searching her face for how she felt about this news. She smiled, tentative but genuine. "I found out this morning. Wanted to be sure before I said anything." He set down the saddle and crossed to her, pulling her into an embrace. A child. A future extending beyond just the two of them, beyond survival and conflict into something new entirely. "Are you happy?" he asked. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "but yes, I'm happy. This place, this life we've built, it's worth passing on, worth fighting for, worth protecting for the next generation." That night, lying in bed with Evelyn's head on his chest, Rhett thought about the journey that had brought them here. The fear and violence, the desperate gambles and narrow escapes. All of it had been necessary to reach this moment. Safe, secure, looking forward instead of constantly watching their backs. The matched colts hung on their pegs in the corner, cleaned and oiled but unused for months. Rhett hoped they'd stay that way, that his child would grow up knowing them only as relics of a time when such things had been necessary. But he also knew he'd keep them ready, just in case. Because the world didn't always respect peace, and sometimes the only way to maintain it was to be prepared for its opposite. In the morning, they'd start planning for the future, a nursery to build, supplies to gather, all the preparations new parents undertook. But tonight, Rhett just held his wife and felt grateful for everything they'd survived to reach this point. The wind rattled the shutters, carrying the smell of rain and autumn. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed their evening songs. The windmill creaked its familiar rhythm, pumping water from the aquifer that had started this whole conflict. Blackthorn Ridge was theirs, fully, finally, without qualification or threat. They'd paid for it in blood and fear and sleepless nights, but they'd paid willingly because some things were worth any price. And now, with a child coming, they had even more reason to ensure that the stand they'd taken, the line they'd drawn, would hold for generations. Their child would inherit more than just land and water rights. They'd inherit the knowledge that courage mattered, that standing for principle was worth the cost, that sometimes the only way to protect what you love was to face down the darkness and refuse to blink. Rhett closed his eyes, feeling Evelyn's steady breathing against his chest, and for the first time in months, he slept without dreams of gunfire or burning barns, just deep, peaceful sleep in the home they'd fought so hard to keep. Outside, the Texas night settled over Blackthorn Ridge like a blanket. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The land endured, patient and eternal, waiting to see what story the next generation would write. And in the morning, Rhett and Evelyn Mercer would wake to face that future together, just as they'd faced everything else, with courage, with love, and with the unshakable certainty that home was worth defending, no matter the cost.